Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
I'm Deputy Carl Hayford, and these are the events of August 28th. The full story, all of it, including what I couldn't put in my official statement. It was a slow night. All of the patients were nice and cozy in their rooms, locked behind reinforced doors and windows that looked out into the shared hallway. The smell of antiseptic cleaner and bleach still lingered from the maintenance crew's weekly scrubbing. It didn't bother me much. I liked the smell. It made everything feel clean and orderly. C Block was where the worst off were kept, the ones that had the highest propensity for violence. The majority of the patients were criminals, or people who had had a complete break from reality and posed a threat to themselves or others, sometimes both. There were 12 cells, 11 occupied by patients, 2 of which were prone to catatonic states. Before coming to C Block, I didn't know there was a difference between comatose and catatonic. I was doing my usual checks. My first stop was almost always George. I walked up to his window and peered in. George was in his 50s, and his states could last for days at a time, but he was awake for the time being. I tapped gently on the glass, and George looked up from his drawing and smiled.
"Deputy Hayford,"
he said, and nodded.
"Sorry about the light. I just woke up this morning, and I'm afraid more sleep may be out of the question tonight."
I shrugged. I wasn't going to hassle you about it. What are you working on? George picked up the drawing and laid it flat against the glass.
"I had a dream while I was away,"
he said.
"The hunt continued."
When he would wake, he would talk about the hunt. Said it was like some dream place he went to while he had one of his spells. Then he'd draw pictures, trying to capture whatever he'd seen on paper. What kind of traps could take down a large predator, where to shoot to incapacitate a deer, things like that. He once made a drawing of a trap that would behead a giraffe. I don't hunt, and I've never seen a giraffe outside of a zoo, but it looked like it could actually work. The newest drawing showed what looked like a man, but reminded me of a beast. His expression was feral and filled with teeth. I nodded to him. "Looks good."
"He's a hunter,"
George said gleefully, then dropped his voice near a whisper.
"But also prey."
I returned his smile, mine not nearly as wide, and walked on to Davy's cell. And Davy's states would last for weeks, but he was never unresponsive. Davy suffered from echoproxia, a fancy way of saying he had a bad habit of copying people's movements. I know that's simplifying it, but I'm no doctor. I always felt bad for him. He was only 19 years old. If you were to walk by his room, he would watch you from the window, and chances were he'd mimic whatever you were doing. If you waved, he waved. If you scratched your chin, he scratched his chin. You get the idea. When he wasn't in one of his states, he was mostly normal. Mostly. That kid loved comic books, sci-fi, fantasy. I would bring him books, and he would speed through them. After a few years, we were friends. Well, as much as we could be, given our situation. So, yeah. Anyway, it was a slow night. After I finished my rounds, I went back to the security office, where I spent most of my time watching the monitors. 2 cameras on each end of the hall, and 1 in each room. The light above the east exit went red, meaning someone was outside. The monitor showed Officer Jennings, Steve when we weren't around patients, standing with the man in restraints. As I watched, He picked up the landline phone from the cradle beside the door. I answered my phone before the second ring. "Steve, what's happening?" I said, looking at the restrained man. "I wasn't expecting the new guest this late." Steve looked up to the camera as he spoke, his slick hair shining in the light of the hall.
"Yeah, sorry about that, Carl. This one had to be kept under the radar. If the press got wind of it, it would have made for a much tougher trip over here, not to mention the death threats."
The mention of the press unnerved me. I pressed a button to pan the camera to the far end of the hall. There stood 4 more guards, weapons drawn, and at the low ready. "Jesus Christ, Steve, who is that?"
"Have you been living under a rock?"
Steve asked.
"Well, let's get 'em inside, and then we'll talk."
I left the office and walked to the door, picking up my keys on the way. 2 key turns and the press of a button later, I was standing face to face with a beast. The man was bald, with scars crisscrossing over his scalp and a patchy beard on his face. Normal enough, but his eyes were just blank. No light, no humanity. That's as close as I can explain. Steve waved the other guards in behind them.
"Where do you want 'em, Carl?"
I pointed to the cell across from Davy. It had been empty the longest. Steve led the man in and removed the restraints. The man went over to the bed and sat, staring ahead at a blank wall.
"Thank God that's over,"
Steve said.
"Come on, we'll talk in your office."
We went in and I shut the door behind us, leaving the guards in the hall. "What is going on here, Steve? It's damn near 2200 and you're bringing me a surprise guest that needs that many guards?" He sat down in my chair, hard, causing the springs to squeak in protest.
I know. I'm sorry, okay? This wasn't my call. And as long as he's in a cell, he's fine. Besides, did you see his eyes? He's sedated, and he won't be causing any trouble for at least 8 hours.
"Well, who the hell is he?" Steve raised an eyebrow at me, incredulous.
"You seriously don't recognize him?"
"If I knew, then I wouldn't have asked."
"That,"
he pointed to the man's image on the screen,
"is Titus Corso, who the media in their infinite empathy dubbed Killer Counselor."
The name hit me like a hammer. Corso used to be a family counselor and had killed 2 entire families. A grand total of 2 men, 2 women, and 7 children. "Christ," I said.
"He would separate the mother from the father,"
Steve said,
"and put them in different rooms, each with 1 or 2 of the kids. He would then convince each of the parents that the other would be let go, children included, if they would kill the children in the room with them."
I remembered. "Yeah," I said. The father would kill the children, then be shown into the other room where the mother had killed the other children, neither of them knowing. Both cases ended with the father killing the mother, and then himself. Steve laughed.
"That's the very definition of fucked up right there."
"Why are you laughing?" I said, my anger rising. That thing in there needs to be put down, not hospitalized." Steve smoothed his mustache with a free hand.
"I'm not arguing with that. Shit, if I could get away with it, I'd walk in there and off him myself. But this is only temporary. He's going upstate to Linwood. But we've had protesters along the route, grandparents swearing vengeance, media vultures hovering overhead. We just needed somewhere to stash him for the night and get the route clear. He doesn't get the luxury of being lynched. He's going into general population at Linwood. Hopefully a bigger animal will kill him slowly and save us some tax dollars."
I took a couple of deep breaths, trying to calm myself. "How long till he's gone?"
"Tomorrow morning,"
Steve said.
7 sharp. I'll call you from the hotel when I'm heading this way."
I looked at the monitor showing Corso's room. He just sat there, staring ahead. I turned back to Steve. Make sure you are. I don't want him here any longer than he has to be. An hour passed, and Corso hadn't moved at all. I walked the hall, holding my notepad and filling out the nightly log. As I passed Davy's cell, he approached his window, miming me, holding an imaginary notepad of his own. I smiled and nodded, knowing it didn't mean anything to him right then. I turned to the opposite side and looked in on George. He was showering, his bathroom curtain closed and steam rising to the ceiling. I was about to go on my way until I noticed the shadows. There were 2 shadows behind the curtain. One was obviously George, who had managed to keep his belly even after years of confinement. The other was a much larger man standing behind him. I immediately pounded on the window as I got my keys out with my other hand. By the time I turned my key and punched in my code, George had opened the curtain. He stood there staring at me, wrapped in a towel and dripping onto the floor.
Deputy Hayford?
He asked, color rising in his cheeks.
What is going on?
I swung the door open hard enough for it to thump against the wall. My hand was on the butt of my pistol, ready.
Where is he?
I asked, trying to remain calm.
There was someone else in here. Where is he?
He shook his head.
There's no one else here,
he said.
I've been told I'm crazy, but I'm not blind.
I walked around him and pulled the curtain all the way back, bunching it up against the wall. Nothing. It didn't make any sense. I knew what I had seen. George must have noticed my expression.
Don't worry, Deputy. Hallucinations happen to the best of us, he said.
I averted my eyes from him. No, I guess it was my mistake. I thought, well, I don't know what I thought. I'll get out of here, let you get back to what you were doing. I could feel him watching me as I left in a daze. As I walked back to my office, I passed Corso's room. He was staring at me, his brow furrowed in anger, but his mouth showed a wide smile. He got up from his bed and hurriedly walked to the window, where he stood, looking me in the eyes.
You interrupted my fun,
he said. His voice sounded like his throat was full of gravel.
Can a person have a little me time without having an armed guard pounded on the door?
What he was insinuating was absurd. That he was somehow able to, I don't know. Get away from the window, I said, as calmly as I could. Corso smiled wider and headbutted the glass. It shook in its frame, and a red welt immediately appeared on his forehead. I pointed my finger at his face.
Stop. Stop it now, or you'll be cuffed again.
He slammed his head forward again. Blood splashed across the glass.
I can do this all day,
Corso said, looking past me and over my shoulder.
But I don't know how much he can take.
I turned to see Davy standing there at his own window, blood pouring down his face. He rammed the glass once more before I could stop him.
Davy, no!
I screamed, but he was in a state and paid no attention to me. I ran to his door, fumbling for my keys. Corso struck the glass again, and Davy echoed the movement. The pen pad shook as I slammed down on the buttons. Their heads collided with the glass once more in unison. I threw the door open just as Davy collapsed. His head struck the floor with a sickening thud, and I slid the last few feet on my knees. With a quick pull on his shirt, I turned him on his side so he wouldn't choke on his blood. He began to convulse. As I tried in vain to keep him steady, I grabbed my radio and thumbed the button. This is Deputy Carl Hayford, C Block. I need emergency medical personnel down here now. A sing-song voice came through the speaker.
Little baby in the dark house, you have seen the sun rise. Why are you crying? Why are you screaming? You have disturbed the house guard.
Davy was still. His last breath was a blood bubble on his lips that slowly shrunk back into his mouth. I stood, then looked through the glass at Corso. I could barely make out his features through the blood. His smile disappeared, and he slammed his face against the glass, smashing it like putty. There was an audible crunch as his nose broke, and fresh blood splattered across the glass as he screamed.
Who has disturbed me?
The lights went out in his room, and he was gone within the dark. I drew my pistol and stepped across the hallway, aiming at Corso's window. Nearby, George spoke from behind his door.
Don't, Carl. He wants you to enter. He wants to trap you. Your prey.
My eyes didn't move from the window. Go away from the door, George. Get towards the back of your room. It'll be safer there.
Carl, listen.
George said.
Don't let him talk to you. If you see him, shoot. Don't hesitate.
As I approached Corso's door, it opened on its own. My hands shook as I slowly stepped into the shadows. And then I was in my house. Not the apartment I'd been living in for the past few years, but the house I had shared with my family. Bright sunlight streamed through the windows over the kitchen sink, and everything smelled just as it always had. Fresh flowers. Jacqueline always loved fresh flowers. I could hear her in the bedroom, our bedroom, crying. Then I realized what day this was.
It was the day she left you.
Corso said. He was sitting on my old couch, blood still running from his face. I wheeled towards him and released the pistol safety.
It's so sad,
he continued,
losing a child so young.
Don't, I said. Just shut the fuck up. He grabbed one of our throw pillows and used it to wipe his face, leaving a half-clotted mess on the fabric.
You know she left because of you, right? Losing the baby was one thing, but you could have had more. But she couldn't live with you. She couldn't deal with your grief. It was stifling. She was choking on your depression like a throat full of black tar.
Get up, I screamed. Stand up! I didn't know what to say. What could I do? I didn't even know what was real. Corso picked up a picture frame from the end table and looked at it, then put it back down.
How did it feel, Carl? Watching her slip away. You wouldn't even hold her after the funeral. All wrapped up in your grief. That's when she knew. The next year was sticking around out of obligation, out of fear. Fear of what you would do to yourself.
I began to cry, crying like I hadn't in years.
Why are you crying? Making noises like a drunkard who cannot sit still on his stool. You know what to do, Carl.
I raised the pistol,
Little baby in the dark house.
Placed the barrel in my mouth.
You have seen the sunrise.
My finger was tied on the trigger. I looked to the window to look at the sunlight, to look out at the yard. What had the view been from that window? Was it the garden? I couldn't remember, so there was nothing outside of the window. I couldn't remember, so Corso couldn't know what to project there. As soon as I pulled the pistol from my mouth, he was on me, throwing me to the ground. I rolled through the threshold, then we were grappling on the floor, each of us trying to get a grip on the pistol.
Give it to me,
He screamed.
you miserable piece of shit!
Corso swiftly brought his knee up into my groin. Pain bloomed like a fire, and I was immediately sick to my stomach. He dropped like a stone, pushing his elbow into my throat until blackness creeped into the edges of my vision. Suddenly I could breathe, and his weight was off me. I turned to my side, retching and gasping, and there was George. He had pushed him off of me and had managed to get his thin, hospital-issued bath towel around Corso's neck. I flailed blindly for my pistol. Corso reached behind him, grabbed it, and pulled him down by the arm.
I'm going to fucking kill you.
He hissed.
I'm going to cherish you with my teeth. I am the house god.
His hiss turned into a scream as George shoved his thumb into Corso's eye, his thumbnail popping it like a grape. Relief washed over me as I grabbed the pistol and quickly aimed at Corso. He reared back and away from George, his hand going up to his ruined eye. I fired over and over again, the shots deafening in the corridor. Corso looked down at his wounds, then at me. He smiled, slumped against the wall, and died. Every breath was fire. My balls ached terribly. I looked at George, standing tall and now completely naked, his body spattered with blood. I tried to form words as he grabbed his towel and covered himself once more.
How?
I croaked.
How did you get out?
He asked. I nodded.
After you barged in, you left the door unlocked.
I laughed, and it hurt, but I laughed anyway.
He thought you were prey,
He said. I nodded.
I was.
I said.
I was just lucky enough to leave the tiger's cage unlocked.
George smiled.
It felt nice to hunt,
He said. The medic showed up a couple of minutes later, and within half an hour Steve showed up, bleary-eyed and half asleep. I gave my statement, at least the parts that didn't make me look like I belonged in one of C Block's cells. I can't explain what exactly happened or how Corso could do the things he did. Did he really convince those people to murder each other, or did he force them like he tried to force me to eat a bullet from my gun? I don't know, just like I don't know why I'm writing this out. 2 nights ago, I woke up in a sweaty tangle of sheets, singing Corso's little song. It happened again last night, and here I am putting all of this on paper, and I'm not sure if it was my idea. I think I have to because I tried to stop and couldn't. Something wants me to write this down. Wants to see its name on the page. Its lullaby spelled out for everyone to read. This whole time, I've been fascinated and afraid of Corso, but I don't think that's who I should have worried about. I've disturbed the house god, and Lord help me, I don't know what to do now.
You have disturbed the house god.
I met the old man at a Bojangles restaurant. I was about 16 at the time and had just dropped out of high school with my parents' blessing. It wasn't the sort of place where you'd learn much of anything, aside from how to take a punch, that is. That was a period in my life where I had no actual idea what I was going to do with myself. School had been a placeholder that took up most of my time, and the sudden freedom was more scary than relieving. I knew I was supposed to be accomplishing something, but other than sketching out doodles and writing half-baked stories, I had no real plans. As usual, my mom ended up planning for me. She decided that I was going to volunteer somewhere and help others while getting some sort of experience that might lead me down the path to a career. That was how I ended up sitting across from the old man in a corner booth at Bojangles. I had ordered fries and a drink while I waited for him, and he showed up when I was about halfway through the poor excuse for lunch. Mom had dropped me off to talk with him while she ran some errands. I didn't really want to go to the farm. I had no interest in manual labor, and I secretly dreaded the idea I'd have to kill or butcher livestock. I convinced myself that one of the other volunteer opportunities, if you can call them that, would pan out, and I'd never have to meet the farmer. In my defense, the charity call center was full of middle-aged, sweaty people who seemed desperate for conversation, and the nursing home outright stank. It didn't help that one of the old ladies called me Jessup and tried to grab me from her wheelchair. So yeah, nothing had worked out, and I had to wait for the old man. He started talking about a bunch of feel-good, old-timey American stuff I can't fully recall. Stuff about hard day's work and how I'd find my reward in natural Christian living. I just nodded and kept eating. I knew I didn't have anything remotely interesting to say to this guy. When he went into how he'd served overseas and how you had to get out of the way of the cannons or they'd take your head clean off, I basically tuned him out. I didn't really stop to think about the situation I was in until he reached across the table with a gnarly old finger to draw the french fries away from me. He pulled them to the center of the table and just kept talking. He decided I should stop eating and pay attention, and that was how he decided to go about it. In my teen years, I was basically a doormat. I didn't know how to say no properly, and I had no idea how to stick up for myself. The only reason I'd gotten out of school was that I'd been choked until I blacked out, and it put enough fear into my parents. I knew I didn't want to volunteer at other places, and I mentioned that, but again, instead of just saying no, I'd gone with, let's see what the next one's like. The old man, the farmer, creeped me out. I guess I should call him Farmer Waken by this point. I'm realizing now that I should have told you this name sooner, but since he didn't tell me that day, I kind of felt natural just referring to him as I'd thought of him then. The old man. He was the poster boy for that term. He was short, much shorter than me, even though I was still growing. Conversely, I guess he was shrinking. His limbs were rail thin and he was bow-legged. An absence of teeth in his face made his mouth pucker inward, and his sunken eyes were milky white behind his thin-rimmed glasses. The outfit was straight out of a rustic painting or something. Blue overalls, red striped shirt, blue cap, brown boots covered in what I hope was mud. At the end of his rambling spiel, I told him I'd think about the offer. He'd put an ad in the paper looking for young people to help in the farm, and in return, they'd learn any number of invaluable skills. He didn't happen to write exactly what that might be. Apparently, something was lost in translation. At least that's what I thought at first. Within days, my mom was planning again. This time, she was plotting our trip out to Waken Farm. I was confused, completely taken by surprise when she casually mentioned the trip. I'd honestly put Waken Farm out of my head. I hadn't given a second thought the second I left that restaurant. When I expressed this to her, Mom said she'd called several times to discuss the preparations and that he'd said I'd agreed to help out. Of course, as you and I both know, I'd done no such thing, and I told her that in no uncertain terms. I may have been a bit spineless, but I wasn't going to let some old, rude weirdo lie about me like that. But yeah, she talked me into it. She insisted that I must have misspoken, or at least he must have misheard. Now he had his heart set on me coming back to check out the farm. No one else had apparently responded to the ad, go figure, and Farmer Waken would have nobody to help keep things running until he could hire some people on where the ad had failed. Trust me, I mentioned the fact that I wasn't happy about doing free hard labor for him, repeatedly. The farm was, as you'd expect, far beyond the reach of modern civilization. My family already lived out in the country, so when I say this was the boondocks, I mean this was really out there. The only way we knew where to stop amidst the infinite landscape of ravaged farmland was by spotting the old wrought iron gateway arching over the correct dirty path. Sheet metal haphazardly cut into jagged letters read Waken Farm. The red paint on the name had peeled away so much over the years that it was barely noticeable as we bumped over the rocks and potholes of the path. Even then, the dust we kicked up was nearly enough to obscure it. Mom said the place was beautiful, but I knew she was just trying to make me feel better about the whole thing. It was a dust bowl. Any square patches of crops, mostly corn, were stunted, withered, and brownish. As we drove down the awkward curving path, I could see a haphazard wire fence containing a handful of underfed cattle. I was already starting to feel that dread in the pit of my stomach again. This time it wasn't over the idea of slaughtering cows. It was just the look of them. I couldn't, in good conscience, ignore the fact that they seemed to be starving. A large red barn, worn like the sign out front, stood at one side of the cattle pen. It was open to the elements, its doors off their hinges, and leaning against the facade. Everything seemed to be in a sorry state, and all at once, I realized the worst thing of all. I was the one who was expected to fix it. We finally pulled to a stop at a crooked little house at the tree line. We'd passed some pigs, a chicken coop, a broken-down tractor, and a few other landmarks. They were all in the same state of repair. Not really worth mentioning, since you most likely get the idea by now. Farmer Waken was sitting in a rocking chair on the front porch. I couldn't have pictured anything more cliched if I'd tried. I expected there to be an old hound dog at his side, but the closest thing to it was a ratty old barn cat that ignored us and focused on a proud rooster nearby. He got up, slowly, probably painfully, and welcomed my mother and me inside. On the way up the stairs, I could hear the crunching of bug-eaten wood. The unsteadiness of the surface put me off balance, and I fell, palms first, onto an unforgiving bed of splinters. A few got under my skin, but only one, a thick one, managed to draw blood. I howled for a moment before pulling the wedge from my hand and pressing the wound tight. I think Farmer Waken had made a comment about me being clumsy. but it's difficult to say due to the shock of sudden pain out of nowhere. Mom used some gauze and hydrogen peroxide in the wound, while the farmer watched from his kitchen table and sipped a cup of something that sounded thick and disgusting. I was embarrassed by the ordeal and apologized to both adults for my stupidity. Mom assured me it was all right. The farmer didn't croak out a word. For the next hour or so, I followed the slow-moving old man around the property. Mom went back to the car while I spent some quality time with him. He showed off all the decrepit junk and half-dead animals with a casual sort of demeanor that almost convinced me the state of things was completely normal. I just wanted to get the tour over with so I could go home. When I was led into the house once again, through the back door, up the creaking steps and down a hallway to a small bedroom, I wasn't sure exactly what Farmer Waken had wanted to show me. What he said next made me feel numb and cold. It was my room. As astounding as it may be, the topic had never come up in any conversation my mom and I had. The time spent volunteering on the farm was a live-in position. I immediately knew Farmer Waken had lied again. He told her we had already discussed it at the restaurant when I had no idea whatsoever. She'd already left, dropping the suitcase off in front of the house. This was the point where I'd had enough and started to speak up for myself. It took way too long and way too much to get to that point, but the time had finally come. I loudly refused the offer and called Farmer Waken a liar directly to his face. His reaction was no reaction at all. He didn't so much as twitch an eyelid. I walked past him, out of the room and down the hall. I'd seen the old man's phone down in the kitchen and made a beeline for it. Of course, I had to leave a message on our answering machine. There was no way Mom had gotten home yet. I told her the basics, that I had never agreed to any of this, and that I wanted her to come back and pick me up. I was on the verge of tears when I hung up the phone to wait for her to either call back or show up at the door, and when I turned back to leave the kitchen, lip quivering like I was a toddler, I ran face first into someone unexpected. Tessie. I didn't know her name at that point, of course, but there you go. She was short, lean, and well-developed by anyone's standards. Her hair was blindingly orange and unkempt only in a very purposeful sort of way. At once I was embarrassed all over again, crying, or nearly crying, in front of a really attractive girl around my age. Part of me wanted to shove her out of the way and barrel out of the house. Tessie asked if I was all right, to which I remarked something awkward and overcompensating, like, "Of course I am," or "What are you talking about?" I know what you're thinking, and no, she did not make me change my mind about staying on the farm. It didn't matter how thin her yellow dress was, or how far down it I could see, if I actually had the audacity to tilt my head forward. That wasn't enough to make me spend a single night in the garage heap they called home. No, what made me stay there was the angry phone call from Mom. The second she heard the message, she called the farm and scolded me for not only trying to get out of my agreement, but for trying to make her drive all the way back right out there after she got home. I could still hear my own simpering voice in the background. She hadn't even listened to the whole thing before grabbing the phone. I wanted to know why she hadn't even let me pack my own suitcase for the stay if she thought I knew about the deal, and she pointed out that I never packed. She noted that she always packed for me because otherwise I wouldn't do it until the last second. She was right, and that didn't make me feel any less awful. With that, I was stranded in Cornhole County with complete strangers. As it turned out, I was going to be there for 3 weeks. I'd never paid attention to the time frame because I thought I'd be making trips out every few days. And of course, I never intended to actually do it anyway. That first night in the house, I didn't sleep at all. I mean, if I did, then I couldn't tell. It's possible that sleep caught up with me for a few moments between glances at the bedroom door. I had an irrational fear that Farmer Waken was going to come into the room in the middle of the night and either forget who I was and shoot me, or do some weird stuff that I didn't even want to think about. When the door creaked open just before sunrise, I nearly screamed. Tessie poked her head in, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. I was both terrified by a stranger intruding on me and relieved it wasn't the old man all at once. After that breathless moment passed, she said she was glad I was there and left just as suddenly as she appeared. The next few days were brutal. It was very obvious to me that Farmer Waken was putting the work of 3 or 4 kids on my shoulders alone. I put things together in a piss-poor manner. I did crummy paint jobs. I wrapped barbed wire until the random cuts got me frustrated. It didn't take me long to figure out I only had to work on the things Farmer Waken would be able to see. I didn't care if everything fell apart on him. As long as the facade gave the impression I'd completed a job, that was good enough. I didn't earn any of my respect or compassion by behaving so awfully in the lead-up to my stay. Tessie, his granddaughter, I assumed, was never there to help with really tough stuff. I'd catch sight of her once in a while, sewing something up or cooking for us. But the only time we crossed paths during the workday had been when she came up behind me with a sparse basket of fresh eggs and smashed one down the back of my neck before bolting away in a fit of laughter. Also, though it wasn't actual interaction, of course, there was a point where I was working up in the barn, and I could see her hosing herself off by the house. I guess that was our closest moment, though she had no idea. While I had grown to hate the old taskmaster, who was now effectively keeping me prisoner, the only thing that frustrated me more than Tessie was their cat. The frazzled, angry little thing that refused to get off the bed when I wanted to collapse from exhaustion and clawed the hell out of my hand the one time I tried to pet it. That was the only thing on the farm I actually wanted to kill, though it was only in fits of impotent anger at the end of a long day. It got to the point where I was so sleep-deprived, sunburned, and overworked that I began to think I was hallucinating. The problem began when I walked back into the house about a week and a half into my stay. The boards didn't crunch under my feet like I'd gotten used to, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time they did. When I studied the area, it looked like I'd replaced the wood and hadn't even realized it. It was like I blacked out and built a porch, something I didn't tend to do. When Farmer Waken got it into his head that he was going to check my work on the barbed wire, supposedly because he heard coyotes that might jump it, I was once again startled to see I'd apparently finished the job when I wasn't looking. Even the crappy effort I'd put in seemed to be correct by an expert. I swear, even the cows looked healthier. I noticed more and more of this as days passed by, slowly. For another example, the tractor I'd fruitlessly toiled away on with no idea what I was doing looked almost shiny and new. It was as if I'd gone out and stolen one to replace the rusted heap that slit my forearm and likely gave me tetanus when I reached in too far. Things were generally getting better, and it was disquieting. Even the cat was groomed and filled out as if it suddenly realized it was supposed to lick its fur and eat cat food instead of fighting with chickens and losing. It dawned on me that Tessie, and even Farmer Waken himself, might have been going around and cleaning up after me. One or both of them could have been redoing all my work the proper way. But when? The old man only left the house to feed livestock and do the least taxing chores, and though Tessie woke up before me and went to bed after I did, she was small-framed and slight, despite any rambunctious spirit in her. Plus, I would have heard either of them working during the night. Even after I stopped worrying as much about night visitors, I remained a light sleeper due to being on edge. I would have noticed hammering, especially on the porch, right below my room. I couldn't square it up in my head, so I decided either I was forgetting things due to exhaustion, or there was some sort of trick being pulled on me. Knowing what a coot Farmer Waken was, I would never have put it past him to have someone doing all of this just to teach me some outdated, foolish lesson or something. For all I knew, he posted Tessie at my door while he had the quietest group of migrant workers fixing things up in the brief moments I passed out completely. In what were to be my last few days on the farm, I got up the nerve to actually have a conversation with a girl I had now been full-on fantasizing about. She was sitting by a small pond just a short walk beyond the trees, somewhere I had followed her to once before, though again I was pretty sure she hadn't noticed. For whatever reason, she went there to cry. She was surprised when I called her from the undergrowth, her orange mane splaying out as her head turned suddenly. Her gasp turned to a smile within moments, however, as she told me she'd been waiting for me to get up the guts and sit with her. So, I assumed that she had actually noticed. I couldn't get straight to the point of things. I knew I was going to ask her about the phantom repairs, but not just right off the bat like that. I had to work to it since we'd essentially never had a real conversation until right then. We talked about the farm, Tessie's favorite music, and even Farmer Waken, and how much she wanted to get away from his dictatorial behavior and away from the house. Apparently, I was far from the first young man that had been brought out for free labor. The peak amount was 5 boys at once, but as time went on, fewer and fewer teens were willing to be suckered in. In fact, there'd only been one young man as of late, and he'd left a full 2 months before I had arrived. The way Tessie talked about him, I could tell that he hadn't been nearly as shy with her as I was. Even though she didn't say anything at all about liking him, I could see exactly how it had been. I was about to approach the subject of repairs I hadn't done, knowing full well I was about to sound like a lunatic, an idiot, or both, when Tessie said something I didn't expect. She called me cute. I wasn't someone who considered myself anything of the sort, not by any means. I'd just drawn in a breath to begin debating the issue with her, when Tessie took my hand and placed it on her knee. To be completely honest, I wasn't the most experienced teenager, so while I had a general idea of what to expect, I had little to no idea what I was supposed to be doing. One sudden interruption followed the other, as rustling came from the woods toward the house. Farmer Waken, of course. He called out for me, then Tessie, and asked why no one was working on the barn or sewing his black socks. Tessie threw my hand off like it was a tarantula and whispered for me to get the hell out of there. She sounded angry, as if I'd been the problem to begin with. I got up and moved into some reeds by the lake and then pushed further into the trees. The last thing I saw before I worked my way back around to the house was Farmer Waken hobbling up to Tessie as she stood to her feet. She cast a quick look in my direction, but didn't seem to see where I'd gone. For all she knew, I'd run off like a frightened rabbit. Farmer Waken spent a few moments scolding her, while she shook her head and pouted at him. I couldn't hear their words, but the tone and body language were clear. Then, they kissed. Not like grandfather and granddaughter should. Not even remotely like it. When I did circle back to the house, I was immediately on the phone again. Now I'd called home multiple times over the 3 weeks I'd been there, but I'd never tried to argue with my mother about the situation again. I knew better than that. However, this time, I explained everything to the answering machine in detail. Something weird was going on. Farmer Waken and his daughter were beyond friendly with each other, and if she didn't come get me, I was going to start walking home, even if I dropped dead on the way. I didn't care if I was being obnoxious or threatening at that point. As far as I was concerned, she deserved it for pawning me off on these freaks just so she could have me out of the house for a while. I should have expected it by this point. Just like the last time, I made a frantic call to Mommy. I turned around to see an all too familiar orange mop standing in the kitchen doorway. I wasn't sure if Tessie had heard the whole thing, but even so, she had to suspect exactly what I was doing. Luckily, Farmer Waken would take a bit longer to make his way back from the pond. At first, Tessie asked how my mom was doing. It was in the sort of sing-song way you talk to someone when you're trying too hard to sound like you aren't mad. I'd heard that before. I explained that I was just calling home, like usual, and I'm sure I sounded like I was trying too hard as well. Tessie brushed past me. She was utterly cold to me now. She walked to the counter and started chopping carrots with a kitchen knife that was entirely too large and unsuitable for the task. I heard footsteps as Farmer Waken walked into the house, but instead of coming to the kitchen, I heard him stop out by the front door. Everything was eerily silent for minutes on end as I stood in the kitchen doorway. When I would look back at Tessie, she was still chopping away, paying no attention to me at all. In my gut, deep inside me, I knew that things were about to go very, very wrong. It was the same feeling I'd get between the claps of thunder during a really bad storm. The next shoe was going to drop, and it was unavoidable. I looked down at my hands. I don't know why. I studied the scratches, the cuts, all the battle wounds I'd collected during my stay on the farm. I looked them over in that moment, and suddenly, a single thought came crystal clear in my mind. Everything that had miraculously repaired itself, from the porch to the tractor and even the cat, they'd all cut me open. I was there to fix things up, but not in the way I'd expected. I was there to bleed. I was feeding Waken Farm. Farmer Waken called from the other room, even though it was only one word. It still carried enough weight to crush the air out of my lungs the second I heard it. Well? I spun in place, nearly tripped over my shoes, as Tessie herself whirled around and leaped at me, knife drawn above her head. The instant her grandfather spoke, presumably to ask her if she'd done what came next, she let out an ear-splitting shriek that I couldn't define as the sound of rage or pain. We rolled to the floor, and Tessie thrust the knife down at me. I wasn't able to block her or grab her arms or anything of the sort. All I could do was pull her down with me and hope she missed. At first, she was insane, maddened by the impossible mix of determination and uncertainty. All at once, she was on top of me, straddling my stomach, and I lay sprawled out and helpless, knife dangling over my heart in small, shaking hands. Thinking quickly, or not thinking at all, my hands moved to her, not with force or hatred, though it was all I could do to contain the natural urge to fight. I knew that one wrong move would put a metal wedge somewhere close to my heart. Staring her dead in the eyes, no doubt displaying every ounce of fear in my soul, I felt for her legs, her thighs, and waist. I held her like I imagined a man would if I had been anything close to one before that moment. I could taste her tears. She softened. Her hands wavered. I sat up incredibly slowly, never breaking from her eyes that were now nearly as red as her hair. She still had the knife in her hands, but now it seemed to have nowhere to go. When I heard the old man's footsteps, much closer now, I moved quickly once more, all but forgetting Tessie. I rolled to avoid whatever Farmer Waken was about to do now, that his granddaughter had faltered. A gunshot echoed through the house, creating a deafening echo in the small kitchen. I'd moved just in time to save my life. Just in time to doom her. Farmer Waken turned pale, whiter still than he'd already been, as he stood in the kitchen doorway. He dropped the smoking hunting rifle to the worn carpet and stared at Tessie as she lay bleeding out. She was still silent, almost a perfect doll, if not for the gushing red patch that had been in her delicate throat. The old man screamed. He dropped to his knees with a crack, and I'm positive he broke bones in the process. He gathered Tessie up in his arms and howled like a wounded beast through gasps and wheezes. I got to my feet and backed out of the kitchen. I was shocked beyond measure, to the point I didn't even think to pick up or move the gun. Farmer Waken rocked Tessie in his arms and begged her not to go. Not after all this time. Not after more than 50 years. I watched as Tessie's blood pooled on the kitchen floor, moving between the tiles and spreading quickly from wall to wall. I watched the cabinets pop and creak as their doors straightened, their hinges tightened, and they took on a new shine. The electric hum of the refrigerator became quieter and quieter as its paint brightened and its handles grew out small fractals of new chrome. The wallpaper came to life with vibrant color, and the ceiling lamp shone brighter than I could stand to look at. 50 years? Waken Farm, a vampiric plot of land in the middle of nowhere. A strange, ghoulish blight on an otherwise unremarkable countryside. Waken Farm, a place young men go to shed blood, sweat, and tears. 50 years. Tessie wasn't Farmer Waken's granddaughter. She was his wife. I ran from Waken Farm. It might be typical to say I never looked back, but I looked back constantly. I checked to see if the old man was following me at every opportunity, even after I reached the end of the dirt path and knew there was no way his crippled legs could bring him that far. I wasn't going to assume anything by that point. Every time I looked back over my shoulder, the house was newer. The first thing we did when Mom arrived at the Iron Gate was to call the cops at the nearest mom-and-pop gas station. Luckily, she believed me about the supposed incest, and now about the attempted murder followed by the actual accidental murder. Some state troopers came out and we actually had to show them where Waken Farm was. They'd never heard of it, despite working in the area. The troopers left us at the end of that dusty dirt path as they radioed for emergency services and took off toward the house, toward the plume of smoke. The house burned to the ground, and all of us knew Farmer Waken had done it. They found Tessie's remains in the house later on. We had to find out from the local TV news, rather than the authorities themselves. The old man had apparently dragged himself outside after starting the fire and drowned himself in the pond out back. I looked into Waken Farm, even though Mom insisted I shouldn't. Under the premise of studying for school, I was able to look up some newspaper articles that seemed loosely related to the place. There wasn't very much, and the information that did exist was mostly innocuous. However, I did find one thing that made it all click for me. I found something about the boy that had been staying at the farm before me, the one Tessie seemed to speak fondly of. It was an obituary. I still think Tessie loved him. I imagined she was an old woman then, tied to an unromantic and cruel husband who stranded them on a hellish farmland that disturbed her. She probably would have never acted on it, but I bet the boy reminded her of a time when she was happy. Some part of me wants to think that she warned him. She didn't want him hurt. She didn't want him paying a price of pain for their upkeep. I think Farmer Waken found out and killed him. Made it seem like an accident. After all, the cause of death was a fall from the very barn I'd been working on. I think Tessie found him, held his body, Didn't care that his blood was all over her. I think that boy gave her back her youth, and by then she didn't want it. Hell, maybe it really was an accident. There's no way to know for sure, and maybe my own disdain toward the old man was clouding my judgment. I don't know if Tessie tried to kill me because they were desperate to cover up what I discovered, or if my death had been planned all along. Did Tessie's change show Farmer Waken that a big enough sacrifice could do the same thing for him? Had it taken 2 months for him to bully, threaten, or even abuse her until she broke down and agreed to kill? When the police were done with the scene and everything was about to be auctioned off, there was a final bit of gossip to come out of Waken Farm. Someone, or something, had left nothing but debris in place of the structures. The crops had turned to dust. The animals were reduced to bone. No one here wants to talk about it, and now that I've spilled my guts like this, neither do I.
The company assigned him to the Riverside Mall, and at first the idea excited Thomas. He hadn't been to that mall since he was a kid. The storefronts, bright and filled with the lights, lit up his memories. The mall's layout nearly unfolded itself in his mind, from the Silver Coin Arcade and the Sal's Pizza to Canale's department store that hid behind the 2-story Carousel and its obnoxiously cheery music. Thomas could still hum the tune with ease. Once he remembered he and his grandmother tried to catch the last feature of some cartoon at the movie theater, but they never made it. Instead, they walked the entire length of the mall in defeat, his grandmother breaking the silence with apologies, but Thomas hadn't said anything because he'd needed no apology. The empty mall was better than any movie. The main corridor, with its high ceilings and avant-garde sculptures of doves floating among spheres of tin, was for them alone. The storefronts were dark, obscured by their gates, and hid their inventories in shadow. Even the carousel was off. The horses, their white teeth and tails touched dulled, were lifeless without the multicolored lights and happy song. Thomas had imagined breaking away from his grandmother and running with all his speed through the empty mall. He enjoyed those images as he exited the highway to downtown Puentes. But what greeted him was not the same joyous building of his memories. Riverside Mall now looked like a blockish beast drudged up out of the river that lazily moved behind it. The sign was rusted, some of the bulbs blackened by neglect. The parking lot was more pothole than asphalt, and within the ruts were nests of cigarette butts and the occasional syringe. The service entrance Thomas was used to was beside the main doors. Its glass was marred by carved names and gang signs. Thomas found the door locked and rang the bell inside. The dayman, Reuben, took a minute before he inched his way to the door and looked out its steel mesh window. He recognized Thomas by his photocopied ID from the company and unlocked the door. The service corridor they walked was drab, the smell of cardboard and cheap disinfectant hanging inside it. The narrow hall was dotted by steel doors for the shops to get their deliveries. The security room was tucked away in its center. Even before entering the little room walled with monitors, Thomas was uneasy. The isolation, the decay, he thought, in the right context, were frightening and strange. The dark had that power, he knew. So did the lonely hours he'd work. Yet what tied all the strangeness together was the old woman waiting for him and Reuben. Mrs. Maria V. Crawford owned them all. She was a plump woman, short in stature, but gave off no air of frailty. Her black eyes were deep, their stare weighty, When she spoke, her voice was surprisingly buoyant and youthful.
You were informed of the standard duties, yes?
She asked. Not really, Thomas said.
The agency told you nothing?
No, he told her. They just gave me the assignment and told me to show up.
That is unfortunate,
she said.
Have you done this work long, Mr. Players?
It'll be one night when I clock out tomorrow, Thomas joked.
So, Mr. Players, what exactly is your experience?
Truth be told, this is my first week out of training, Thomas admitted. I had some career changes. This, too, seemed to vex Mrs. Crawford. She lifted her hand to silence him.
No matter,
she said finally.
This job does not require much skill. For an hour, you will sit in this room and watch these monitors. If anything odd occurs, call the authorities. If nothing, once that hour is up, you will walk the building. If again you see nothing, return and repeat the process.
Have you had a lot of break-ins?
No,
she answered, offering no more explanation than that.
As you no doubt noticed, this place is past its prime. More than likely, any thief would target the pawn shop down the road. No, I'm more interested in not incurring additional costs, other than your employment, of course.
Yeah, with this economy, Thomas started to say.
The economy has little to do with it,
Crawford corrected.
Simply put, the city has grown outward and the area is no longer fashionable. Now, even the lowliest of anchor stores wants nothing to do with a mall that's on the outs, to borrow a creditor's phrase. One day, I suppose, if I were so inclined, I could sell the land and get a hefty profit. But that brings me to the most important part of our meeting. My son, Leonard,
Mrs. Crawford said. The way she spoke his name seemed to drive the air from the room. Does he work here too? Thomas asked. The question made the silent Reuben fidget. Mrs. Crawford glared at him.
My son is unable to work. So much of what was canon in my youth is now barbarity and madness. There were complications with Leonard. A prenatal supplement. Methathormiacin, it was called. That's what made him different. You see, my son is unique. Shy. He was born healthy, strong, but his mind never truly developed.
Thomas smoothed his hair. I'm sorry to hear that. Reuben groaned.
Apologies are for tragedies, Mr. Players,
she shot back.
My son is a miracle. A misunderstood miracle,
she continued.
Children with his condition usually die in the womb. But not my Leonard, not my sweet, curious boy. It was people, with their ignorance and mockery, that drove him into this state and forced my hand. Leonard tried the world and was left wanting. So I opted for this new arrangement instead. See, he always loved this place, so I let him wander around at night when no one is here. He likes to look into the shops, play in the arcade, and even ride the carousel. The boy can work it by himself.
Okay, I'll introduce myself and...
You most certainly will not meet my son,
Mrs. Crawford said.
People looking at him, that triggers the old feelings. People made him uncomfortable and still do. I've informed him that you will be here during his playtime and to ignore you. So if you hear the carousel or see the arcade gate open, it is Leonard, and thus no cause for alarm. But I cannot stress it enough. Don't speak to him. Don't gesture to him. And above all, do not
Look at him.
Did the last guy do that?
My lawyers have informed me to say nothing of Mr. Arredondo's accident,
Crawford said, struggling to rise. Carlos moved to help her, but one stare sent him back to the wall. Standing finally, Mrs. Crawford told him,
In spite of all I've told you, this should prove to be a very mundane job. 1 hour here, 1 hour of rounds. Repeat until Reuben opens in the morning.
Yes, ma'am,
Good.
she said, waddling to the door.
If there is an incident with a thief, you can explain it to a police officer.
She said,
Leonard, on the other hand, if he were to catch someone... The bathroom is next to the food court, and all the vending machines work.
I didn't bring any change, Thomas said, patting his clothes. Mrs. Crawford grinned almost imperceptibly.
That's a pity,
she said, and left. Reuben opened the door for her and hurried down the corridor to open the rest. Thomas stood in the guard station and tried to adjust to the vast and empty solitude. The walls of monitors served as a reminder that Riverside Mall was once the third longest in Texas. One screen showed the Carousel at an odd angle, and Thomas remembered that he wasn't alone. In that giant building, it was just him and Leonard. Thomas dreaded that first night. The thought of making the rounds in the dark with a socially inept recluse tensed his shoulders and tightened his jaw. The monitors didn't help. Their lack of color and sound mixed with the shadows of the storefronts and kiosks made everything look sinister, and all of their angles were off-center. Thomas thought it was a way of letting Leonard move around without being seen. That realization made his anticipation worse. At the top of the hour, Thomas took a series of deep breaths and walked into the main corridor of Riverside Mall. It was a shock to see the state of a cherished childhood memory. What was left were the scraps of commerce. The benches were square slabs of reclaimed planks painted a sticky blue, and the rectangular pots for mid-mall plants were filled with cancerous fiddle leaf and cigarette butts mixed with the stale dirt. Some of the gated storefronts, Thomas realized, had been closed long before he ever got there, their innards vacant except for the shells of countertops and the bones of display racks. Empty places with signs from a dying era, copies of a copy of a copy, until there was nothing left but their distorted remains. One such place was J&B Toys. Its sign was a smiling train, and from its smokestack puffed the store's name in a font popular 20 years ago. From what he saw, the toys, teddy bears left to die in piles, and a wall of discolored heroes with misspelled names, were either entirely generic or plain knockoffs. Thomas used his flashlight to see a stack of off-putting baby dolls in the back of the store. Even from that distance, Thomas felt the itch of their cheap fabric. Another, which replaced the long-gone Zoinks, was a sporting goods store where for all the time Thomas stared into it, he couldn't find the brand name on any of the equipment. It depressed him to see Riverside in such a state. His boots scrunched on the broken tiles, and he dodged more than one construction area. Open holes in the floor taped off with cheap plastic ribbons and anchored by trash cans. But as he neared the eastern wing, a faded sign brought a smile to his face. The Silver Coin Arcade. All the old memories of pumping quarters into the Kothdar the Barbarian cabinet, or firing off round after round in Classroom of the Dead, these made him nearly run to it. Though Thomas knew what kind of place the Riverside Mall was now, he hoped somehow, by some miracle, the arcade had been spared by time. The smell of its carpets and walls dashed his hopes away. A stale stink of mold and cigarette smoke left to moisten in the humid air wafted through the lowered cage door. Some of the games were still inside, the few remaining game cabinets discolored and chipped, but they had been replaced mostly with slot machines and video poker. Thomas lingered, hoping to glimpse any game of his youth, but was disappointed again. He turned away, and knowing no one would care, lit a cigarette. The smoke couldn't make Riverside Mall any worse with its coin-operated rocket ships half destroyed and its lone restaurant, pizza and beer, stinking of congealed grease and farts. He didn't see or hear Leonard that first night. Riverside seemingly only vague shadows as though wanting Thomas to mourn what had once been. Still, he kept his mind sharp, ready to stop at any strange echo or whispered word. Yet, it wasn't until the fourth night that Thomas had any real evidence that Leonard really existed. On the 6th hour of his shift, Thomas stood at the front window of Babette's, which, from the merchandise, catered to the slutty but economical grandmothers of the area. After lighting a cigarette, he noticed one of the potted plants had been dug up. The soil and cigarette butts were scattered on the floor, and they'd been arranged in an almost childlike way. Simple shapes, the sun and moon. Further down the main corridor, dirty handprints smeared the walls and smudged the display window of a jewelry store. Their cubic zirconia and glass pieces glistened like distant stars. Further still, one of the store's gates had been lifted enough for someone to squeeze through. In the heavy silence, hangers clacked on their racks and heavy feet slapped on the tile in the dark. Something in the dark laughed, throaty and buffoonish. Thomas froze. It wasn't the jubilant laughter of a thief collecting loot, but of a child overjoyed to have found some shiny bauble that might entertain them. Yet there was a raw power to the sound, a strength in its childish unpredictability. Careful not to make noise himself, Thomas backed away slow. As Mrs. Crawford had told him, all he had to do was make the rounds and leave Leonard alone. If it was a thief, he'd find out about it the next pass. If Crawford got mad, he'd say all he did was follow her instructions. Back in the surveillance room, Thomas watched the monitors diligently. Even the hint of movement sent him face to face with one of the greasy monitors. But the angles were frugal with their secrets. He didn't see or hear Leonard again that night, though now his rounds were exercises in dread, each step a false herald to Leonard's idiotic and powerful laugh. Leonard followed him 2 nights later. Thomas had patrolled from the center of the mall to the Carousel. The fat Carousel, painted to resemble a circus tent, was as savage as the rest of the mall. The horses were tattooed, the brass torn off their saddles and hooves, their noses rubbed free of paint. The old scenes painted on the inner walls were hidden in tagger scrawl. Thomas thought he had heard something, a scrape against the metal of the 2-story carousel, but paid it no attention. The carousel was old and abused, decaying a little each day until all that would be left were wooden carcasses flecked in paint. Thomas had made a ritual of his patrols. Since no one had said anything about his smoking, Thomas lit a cigarette at either end of the mall and enjoyed it on the way back to the surveillance room. That night, Thomas stopped inside of one of the entrances. The light pollution seeped into the hall like a limp tongue. Outside, his car sat alone in the parking lot, and the river flowed on. He smoked his cigarette slowly, watching the glow of the moon surf on the river. When the cherry singed the filter, Thomas stubbed the cigarette out on his heel. As he did, a shape receded behind one of the rectangular pots behind him. From the little Thomas saw of the shape, it had the dimensions of a person. Thomas didn't look back, knowing it was Leonard. Any junkie thief would have clubbed him to sleep already. Instead, Thomas continued his rounds and kept his strides even and calm. But if Leonard saw Thomas's face, he'd know, even in his condition, that Thomas was terrified. Now all Thomas heard between his steps were the soft pads of bare feet hurrying from shadow to shadow. Some creature that had been put into hiding, isolated from all the world. In rehab, Thomas learned that sometimes solitude helped ease a troubled mind, yet in others, it further degraded them. Thomas tried to put a positive light on Leonard's curiosity. He thought perhaps Leonard was like a puppy sniffing behind the new visitor. The thought made breathing easier, until Thomas remembered that even if Leonard followed him out of curiosity, Leonard was still very much human, and as such, had a natural proclivity toward the deviant, like himself. Maybe, he thought, Leonard followed to see if Thomas touched a favored plaything or otherwise disobeyed some unspoken rule of the house. Poor Thomas panicked. Leonard's state of mind might be toward the violent, toward ideas that would have Thomas pinned face first on the floor with an idiot's fist breaking his bones, and all the screaming would make Leonard pound harder and harder, until Thomas needed to go to San Antonio or Houston for experimental surgeries for repair. His imagination threatened to drown him. It made Thomas's entire being endure the primal struggle between survival and reason. Every cell wanted to run at the grunts formed out of Leonard's mouth, wanted to jump at every treble-filled breath. He told himself to walk slowly, calmly. Leonard, by all accounts, was like a pet tiger. Like all captive animals grown accustomed to people, Leonard was calm but unpredictable and dangerous. Thomas reacted to the service hall door same as seeing God. Still, even when the door was closed behind him, Thomas didn't sprint for the surveillance room. If Leonard was a wild beast man, even the sound of retreat might trigger a rampage. So Thomas made his way to the room slow and opened the door as if he were bored. Though he kept his ear trained for it, the service door never opened. Thomas locked the door and didn't leave until Reuben relieved him the next day. Leonard was bolder the next few nights. He never stood in plain sight, but was louder and sloppier in his trailing. The full weight and strength of his limbs were present in the sounds of his observations. Throughout, Thomas kept his pace and his hand on the company nightstick, though he knew it would do him little good. Every scenario of Leonard's attack ended with Thomas's death, usually a horrible one. During one night, lighting a cigarette, Thomas caught a glimpse of Leonard in the reflection of a mirrored column. For the nights afterward, Thomas held his nightstick so tight he had to ice his hand at home. It wasn't his own morbid imagination now. He understood. He knew Leonard's dimensions. Mrs. Crawford said he was special, shy. Thomas had thought it was due to a stunted mental age, but the deformities hadn't stopped with Leonard's mind. They seeped into his limbs. After seeing him, Thomas understood why the cameras were at such odd angles. The bulbous skull and crooked maw. One arm raised, pressed to his chest as if injured, and the other was twisted but strong. All of his visible skin was patchy and gray, and Leonard moved like an ape, the large arm leading and the deformed legs slipping behind. But as crippled as Leonard seemed, Thomas knew the truth. Leonard was a threat. The man, isolated from society and its concepts of boundaries save the most primal, could do all types of things to Thomas against his will. Through it all, Leonard stayed away, never venturing close enough to touch or be seen, yet he was always there. At the end of one shift, Thomas asked Reuben about Leonard.
"Just don't look at him,"
Reuben said, shrugging.
"He won't do anything."
"And he's running around all night following me," Thomas went on. He's followed me.
I used to have your job,
Reuben said.
Leonard is ugly but harmless. Just leave him alone. If he follows you, it's because he's curious.
About what?
He's like a dog,
Reuben answered.
He just wants to know who you are. In time, he'll get bored and leave you alone.
Thomas nodded and went home to soak his cramped hand in ice water. Carlos had been right. After a week, Leonard didn't hound Thomas on his bi-hourly patrol. It seemed Leonard found him as boring as all the other security guards and went back to terrorizing the mall in his own harmless way. Leonard squirmed his way into the toy store one night and overturned a bin of teddy bears. Thomas heard his brutish laugh throughout his entire patrol. On another, Leonard managed to turn on one of the games in the Silver Coin Arcade. Thomas walked to the brief tunes of 32-bit glory cut short by sounds of loss and Leonard's frustration. But most nights, Leonard just played on the carousel. Thomas never saw it, even in the surveillance room. The cameras only caught the light-edged rim of the carousel. But Thomas heard it. The cheap circus music scratching through worn-out speakers, the squeak of gears, and Leonard's laughter. Full of sound and fury as his joy was, Thomas couldn't help but hear a twinge of innocence in it. Perhaps it was Leonard's glee that Thomas felt somehow matched his own when he had ridden that carousel as a boy. Or maybe it was how Reuben had explained it. Leonard was basically a puppy, not inherently good nor evil, just a creature of reactions. Prone to fits of overpowering emotion, there was a bestial quality of Leonard's intelligence, but no malice in it. More and more, Thomas pitied Leonard Crawford, the harmless but forever shunned. Ugly but kind, drawn to the meeting places of the public, but only when they were gone, leaving nothing but the ghosts of their scents. Thomas thought the world was cruel then. Leonard was a perfectly fine creature confined to the decaying Riverside Mall for nothing more than the comfort of the masses. If only they heard him laugh, Thomas thought. At first, as it was with him, the sound would be frightening. The sheer palpability of it was seldom heard in daylight. But if they could only listen, Thomas knew they'd feel its warmth and innocent joy. It was infectious. Not that he ever dared join in. In fact, Leonard hid whenever Thomas got within 50 yards of him. But Thomas listened and grew to admire it. Soon his admiration turned to envy. Thomas used to laugh like that. Used to look at the world like it was built on magic and miracles. Life stole that from him, though Thomas couldn't remember exactly how. Ex-girlfriends took some of it with them, a few by force. School took another along with a sizable chunk of his wages still. Work stole the rest, grinding away the days, gnawing until the weeks slid by with nothing to show for it but more bills and neck pain from a shitty mattress Thomas couldn't afford to replace. Thomas had tried to find that magic again with booze and smoke, but they had only left him twice as empty and twice as broke. But not Leonard. Leonard had learned enough of the world to hide from it, memories of scorn still fresh in his simple mind. Leonard's life was frolicking through the garbage of visitors like they were relics of his home world. Still, Leonard laughed with his entire being, all over a carousel he had ridden for years. In the surveillance room and on the way home, Thomas tried to recall a time he was ever happy enough to laugh like that. The fact that he couldn't stung him for days. Thomas got it into his head that seeing Leonard play on the carousel would somehow transfer some of that childish joy into him. Enamored with the idea as Thomas was, he still knew Leonard was dangerous. But all he needed was a glimpse, a quick look at Leonard's happy face. To do so, though, Thomas knew he'd have to be quiet. It took days of deliberation to convince himself to do it. A part of him said this was Leonard's private matter, but the thought was demolished by Thomas's selfishness. He, the world, needed the unbridled positivity hidden away at the Riverside Mall. All Thomas had to do was witness it and accept it like a virus. The world would be a better place if he took that look at Leonard in his moments of pure joy. For a week, Thomas only left the surveillance room when the cheap circus music came on. Even then, he walked only close enough to see the lights play across the storefronts. He got close, but never too close. On one night, though, it played like a siren song, and Thomas decided he'd finally look. Thomas removed his boots, feeling the gritty through his socks, and stepped a few times to test the silence. Next, he lit a cigarette and puffed at it until the cherry was bright and strong. Thomas left it burning on one of the potted plants. He thought that if Leonard was like an animal, the smoke smell might deceive Leonard enough for Thomas to get close. In the distance, the carousel echoed. Leonard's laugh was its offbeat percussion. As Thomas got closer, the carousel revealed itself by centimeters, mere glimpses of the colored bulbs at first, then the edges, and eventually the faces of horses. Defiled as they were, they kept a steady pace, the gears all greased and in working order. It took Thomas a moment to spot Leonard. Thomas thought he'd find him at the bottom, his disfigurement not allowing any seats beyond those. But Leonard was resourceful, and Thomas saw him on the second story in a two-seater shaped like a carriage, pulled by a thick-necked Clydesdale. Leonard raised his misshapen arm as though holding a set of invisible reins, snapping the imaginary leather to urge on his steed through some childish adventure playing in Leonard's head. All this brought forth that laugh Thomas wanted. Thomas stepped closer and stared at Leonard's face. His eyes were semi-closed and mouth gaped open like a wound. His joy revealed yellow, twisted teeth. Yet Thomas saw through the asymmetry of Leonard's features. He saw no skin color splashed over Leonard's cheeks, paid no mind to the disproportioned skull. All he saw was joy, pure as the universe, refined. It was a thing no amount of money or drugs could replicate. The carousel's revolution hid Leonard from sight, and Thomas was filled with what he was convinced was the grace of charity. In flashes, he went over the next few months with Leonard, the gaining of trust and the start of their friendship, all because Leonard saw that Thomas wouldn't look away and didn't treat him cruelly. Thomas could teach Leonard to speak, he imagined, and Thomas would, after many discussions, reveal to Leonard that it was the simple joy he displayed on the carousel that inspired Thomas to be a better person. These dreams filled Thomas with a sleepy warmth, a sense he had found a path to be proud of, one that would lead him to the heights of human experience. When Leonard came around again, he stared at Thomas.
It's okay,
Thomas said, patting the air.
I'm not here to hurt you. I want to be friends.
Leonard was uncertain of what to do next, but after a few moments, he shuffled to the edge of the carousel and sniffed the air as if to test it. Leonard revolved closer and Thomas got a clearer view of the extent of Leonard's deformities. The goiters and swellings, the patches of hair and scaly skin.
It's okay,
Thomas called, the carousel turning so Leonard was hidden again among the rods and wooden steeds.
I just want to be friends.
When Leonard returned, a distortion had overcome his frame, settling most startlingly in his eyes. There was no childlike innocence to them. Yellow and sickly, they had more tiger than lamb. Thomas stood in their predatory focus and knew another pure experience as old as life. Fear. The fear mice have of hawks. The fear of lost calves at the howls in the night. There was no humanity in Leonard's eyes, only an aggression so complex that Leonard's mind couldn't articulate it in anything but the hunched pose of a wild animal ready to pounce. Like his laughter, Leonard's roar was hypnotic. Thomas didn't react to Leonard climbing down his carousel and jettisoning toward him like a wounded ape. Only when Leonard was a few feet away, teeth bared and voice quaking, did Thomas turn to run. But his sock slid on the tile and he landed on his knees. Like a sugar-coated infant, Thomas crawled away as fast as he could. Though nearly sprinting on all fours, Thomas knew it was useless. Leonard would tear him limb from limb. But the animal part of Thomas's brain strobed horrid scenarios at him, spurning him to be away, away, away. Something heavy landed on his back, flattening Thomas out and blasting the air from his lungs. His brain tried to summon all his strength and more. Only Thomas's arms responded, flailing fruitlessly, because his legs had ceased to work. A big, grotesque paw clamped onto the back of Thomas's skull and pressed his forehead into the towel. Screaming, Thomas felt the cheap towel crunch under his forehead and felt Leonard's weight on his neck. Behind his eyes, a pressure built until Thomas couldn't shut them against their swelling and forceful evacuation. Blind, Thomas was consumed by the monstrous pressure. Yet through it all, Leonard laughed, hearty and strong, and the carousel played its scratchy song.
Dallas skipped a stone as he sat on the bank of a tributary of the Elk River. His aluminum two-man canoe gently bobbed in the lazy current. His gear already loaded, he waited for his partner. He yawned, stretched his lanky frame, and scratched an itch under his unkempt beard. He wore an old beat-up set of multicams in a way that would have driven his sergeant first-class nuts were he here. Blouse unzipped and hanging like a civilian jacket. Pants on blouse and hanging over broken-in coyote brown suede leather combat boots, and a rattlesnake skin cowboy hat tilted back on his head. His steel blue eyes scanned the river and trees on the opposite shore. Before Iraq, he never noticed the various shades of green sported by the aspens, oaks, walnuts, and other leafy trees of West Virginia. Soon the green would change to a blaze of yellows, oranges, and reds. He did not know, or care to know, about the history of tectonic plates thrusting up the Earth's rocky mantle to form the Appalachians, or about how erosion wore the mountains down to almost a plain before geological forces once more propelled rock into the sky. Dallas did not care about the natural processes that took place over the span of hundreds of millions of years to form the forests, mountains, and ridges around him. He skipped another flat stone across the serene tributary. Plop, 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 splash. He smiled as 7 skips was a personal record. His hand searched for another, but stopped as the crunching of truck tires on gravel seized his attention, his head snapping toward the sound. A red late-model Dodge Ram came to a stop next to his newer forest green Ford. Its diesel engine angrily knocked as the driver put the truck in park, the engine sputtering stubbornly to a stop as the driver's door opened. Dallas watched as black combat boots reached for the ground. Faded olive drab pants hung lazily about the driver's feet. Dallas spat out his dip, his eyes narrowing as he appraised his partner for this weekend's harvest. The other man, whose real name was Mark, was short, stocky, and old to Dallas's early 30-something eyes. This was the man that, when Dallas was 5, stepped in when his father abandoned him and his mother. When the older man's hair and beard turned silvery white, he looked like Kenny Rogers. This earned him the nickname Kenny, not only from Dallas, but from Mark's friends and family as well. Kenny reached into the bed of his truck and pulled out an old beat-up leather gun case. Unzipping it, he removed a lever-action rifle and slung the .30-30 over his right shoulder. He grabbed his backpack and made his way over to Dallas. "What do you know?" he asked in the Appalachian accent, echoing the region's early Anglo-Scot colonists. After dropping his pack and laying the rifle across it, he extended his hand to Dallas. Less than pleased, Dallas did not move. His cold eyes studied his temporary partner. Kenny withdrew his offered hand. Dallas pushed himself to his feet, proud that at 6 feet 1 inch he stood at least a head taller. He did not wince at the momentary stab of pain as his right knee popped from an old injury. Getting up revealed the bottom half of a holster holding a .44 Magnum revolver his father had given to Kenny. He took off his hat and ran his fingers through brown hair as wild and untamed as his beard. "You're late." His voice was a clear and slow Midwest monotone. He turned and started pulling the canoe closer to shore so the old man could get in and they could begin the journey to the honey hole. "There!" Kenny in the front of the canoe pointed excitedly at a break in the trees on the left bank. "Them trees." Dallas steered the canoe toward the break. The water turned from green to clear as they neared shore. Minnows scattered as the aluminum hull scratched and scraped across mud and river rock. 10 feet away, a 6-foot water moccasin turned its head and considered the interlopers for a moment before languidly slipping into the water and disappearing. Kenny secured the canoe to a tree as Dallas waded to the riverbank. The men pulled the canoe into the woods and hid it in the brush. "My pop found his honey hole 20 years ago. Pulled so much sing out of the ground. Some of them had to be 25 or 30 years old if they were a day," Kenny chatted as they made their way along a game trail. "Last year prices were about $1,600 a pound for dried. Didn't clean out the honey hole though. He left some for later. Let the seed spread. Pa respected the land and the root, you know." Dallas nodded and started up the path as the wind rustled the branches of the trees surrounding them. "We'd better hurry up and find good land to pitch camp." His eyes scanned the position of the sun through the branches. "It'll be dark soon." The fire crackled and sent sparks flying into the inky blue night sky. Dallas imagined them seeking to join the trillions of stars in the West Virginia sky. He watched as each one winked out in their doomed quest to become something great, something immortal. He loved the peace and silence. "You know," Kenny started, likely feeling the need to fill the silence, "I read somewhere some archaeologists said the first sign of civilization is a healed bone." He paused for a response. Not getting one, he carried on. "See, a broken bone means death for an animal. Even herd or pack animals leave the broken behind for predators. However, a healed bone means a group took the time to nurse and protect the broken rather than leave them to keep a wolf's belly full so it would stop hunting for a day or two." Dallas neither moved nor spoke. "Still holding on to that grudge?" Kenny asked. Dallas looked at him as he leaned back against a tree, his hat lowered over his eyes. "Come on, I said I was sorry. That's why I brung you on this trip, to make amends." Dallas's chest rhythmically rose and fell with each inhale and exhale. He made no other movement. "Well, ain't you gonna say something?" Dallas's chest rose higher than before and paused before he let out his breath. "You left me to die, to drown, asshole. Does that mean you're uncivilized?" He didn't give his former mentor a chance to answer. One honey hole is only the beginning of repaying that debt. He left his hat down, concealing a piercing and accusing gaze. "One honey hole," he huffed. "Better be a big one, and then it'd only be the start of fixing what you broke." "Listen, son." "I'm not your son." "You know what I mean." Kenny studied his partner for a moment. "Look, you're the best digger I ever trained. You're my best friend's son. I love you like you're my own." "Yeah, you did, and I trusted you just like I did him." Dallas shrugged. "But I guess that's just what father figures do, abandon their sons." "I told you I had to get help." "Keep telling yourself that. We all know the only reason you've ever been around is for yourself. You got close to me so you could fuck Mom." Kenny's face turned red. "Listen here, you little shit. You moved back home looking for peace after all you saw over there? Some thought you'd just be another drifter. Others mocked you, called you Rambo behind your back, and not in a good way." He leaned over and angrily poked the fire with a stick. "If you haven't noticed, I'm trying to make it up to you." "We'll see," Dallas said before rolling over and turning his back on Kenny. You're just gonna turn your back on the man who almost killed you? Dallas rolled back over and lifted the brim of his hat just enough to appraise the old man. He smirked and chortled dismissively before rolling back over. What's that supposed to mean? Let's just say I know killers, old man. I see one every time I look in a mirror. If you're too much of a coward to save my life, you ain't going to have it in you to kill me. After a few moments, Dallas was softly snoring. Dallas awoke to the sound of something rummaging through his pack. He slowly opened his eyes as a stench like a junkyard dog sprayed by a skunk assaulted his nostrils. Combat in Afghanistan taught him how horrible humans could smell, but no human could stink like this. It was wild and bestial. The remains of their fire had been snuffed out by a light rain, and the moonlight through the wood's canopy afforded little help. He made out the hulking form of what he assumed was a bear, but he just closed his eyes. This was not the first time he had feared for his life in the dark. He heard Kenny stirring awake. Dallas once more opened his eyes. The shadow froze, the indistinct head shape turning towards Dallas's partner. "Dallas, that you, buddy?" Kenny asked. The shadow moaned. It was a harsh, grating, and long-drawn utterance that sounded peculiarly sinister. Then it crashed through the trees, fleeing the campsite. Its stench lingered as Dallas began to move. "What in the actual book was that? Did you see it?" Kenny asked. "I didn't see nothing," Dallas said as he looked around. "Stinky bastard. Probably some bear. Smells like he fell into a lagoon. Damn big black bear." Kenny shrugged. "Who knows? Sometimes things look bigger in the dark." The rest of the night passed without sleep for the two men. They heard little aside from the occasional rustle in the woods or snap of a twig, neither one of which helped calm the feeling of being watched as the sinister odor faded but refused to disappear. With the aid of morning's light, they looked for tracks in the soft mud. What they found had been deformed by more rain that spat throughout the night. "That bear walked on 2 legs," Kenny exclaimed. "They almost look human, too." Dallas could only chuckle. "It wasn't Bigfoot, you old coot." Kenny shrugged as he finished repacking his backpack. Dallas tried to ignore that it actually didn't look like it had been a bear. The trip to the honey hole was long on tired legs. The sound of movement just beyond sight as they made their way to Kenny's secret crop did little to ease their jangled nerves, nor did it help that they were surrounded on 2 sides by mountains. Eventually, Kenny led them up the mountain just above some exposed rock. When they found the honey hole, it was better than Kenny had said. The bumper crop of old-growth ginseng lifted their spirits and energized them. Not only did the pair forget about the sensation of being stalked, but they even went nose-blind to the foul stench. "You gonna do any more harvesting this year?" Kenny asked as they began planting seeds from the mature plants they had collected. "I get this sold and added to what I've already banked, and I got my year." "Maybe," Dallas replied, having warmed again to his mentor. "But no offense, I'll be doing it alone." "Still seeing Nikki?" "No," Dallas shook his head. "She couldn't take my night terrors anymore. She left last week." He took a deep breath. "Can we just focus on planting?" The seeds would take decades to yield a day like today. While there was no guarantee they would reap the benefits of their labors, another ginseng hunter would. The sun began setting and they decided to camp in a glade not far from the honey hole. It was bordered on one side by a stream. On the other, the mountain sloped upward. The unease surrounding the events of the night before began to set in. Both were exhausted, and after a meager meal, they decided to take turns staying awake. Dallas took the first watch. Shortly after Kenny started softly snoring, a low rustle on the slope grabbed Dallas's attention. A black mass was moving down the opposite slope. Branches crackled as the demon moved through the trees and brush. It stayed in the shadows, not venturing into the bubble of light given off by the campfire. Dallas considered taking a shot, but the beast seemed to know how to move and take cover in ways that prevented a clear shot. He counted a half-dozen times that the creature seemed to sit and utter a peculiarly sinister-sounding grunt. A light breeze carried the foul stench, similar to a skunk. Dallas shined his flashlight across a thicket. He could make out nothing but shadow and leaves until the beam moved across the animal's eyes. The eye shine was blood red and elicited a grating, harsh moan drawn out for as long as Dallas held the light. His heart stopped and his breath caught in his throat. He had not felt fear like this since the first time his unit was attacked a lifetime ago. His heart began beating again and his breath returned as he jerked the light away. He gained control of himself and shined his light back where the monster had been seconds earlier. Nothing stared back at him. Next to him, Kenny began to stir.
See something, Dallas?
The bear came back, was just in that thicket. I saw his eye shine. It was red as blood. Kenny was silent for a long moment.
Strange. Bear's eyes shine orange. Maybe it was something else.
Yeah, old man. Dallas peered into the darkness. It's gone now, and I'm tired. It's your watch. No longer interested in debating, he found his bedroll and pretended to be asleep as Kenny tried to carry on a conversation. The older man chattered on about the legends of Bigfoot for a few minutes more before giving up, and Dallas was able to finally drift asleep. Dallas awoke to the scent and sizzle of bacon frying and the sound of eggs being scrambled.
"Morning,"
Kenny curtly replied, setting the bowl of eggs aside and taking the bacon off the cast iron pan he carried with him.
"Breakfast is almost done."
Smells good. Dallas watched as Kenny served breakfast and handed a plate to him before sitting and beginning to eat in silence. Dallas cleared his throat. What, no stories about Bigfoot?
"You know, Dallas, at some point a man's got to decide. Does he accept the apology of someone who did him wrong, or does he just move on and part ways?"
Kenny sat his plate down.
"Likewise, a man who's made a mistake and tried to atone for it has to decide at what point he's done enough to satisfy his conscience and walk away from a friend who won't accept his apology. I made a mistake. I've tried to make up for it. Now you can either forgive me or not. There's nothing else I can do."
Dallas simmered with rage. Seriously? You left me for dead and think a simple apology and showing me a honey hole makes up for it? He shook his head. We have a code in the military to never leave a man behind. I thought you held true to that. I was wrong and it nearly cost me my life. I think you mean what you say when you're trying, but I'm not ready to trust you yet.
"Holding on to that kind of negativity will eat at a man,"
Kenny said as he shoveled the rest of his breakfast into his face.
"Besides, I didn't leave you when my piece of shit best friend left his wife and you behind."
The two men finished their breakfast in silence. Their path back to the canoe was not easily traced after the rain. After reorienting themselves, they were led along a crevice about 8 feet deep. Both sides were of smooth rock about 30 feet high, but only one side had a ledge wide enough for one person, unladen with pack or rifle, to carefully make their way to the other side. Dallas went first, sedimentary rock periodically crumbling and tumbling into the shallow void. He trailed a rope tied on one end to their packs and rifles. He would drag them over when he was safely across. Then it was Kenny's turn. With his eyes closed and his back pressed against the stone wall, he began sidestepping the narrow pathway. Halfway across, the ledge under his left foot crumbled, causing him to lose his balance. He stumbled and slid into the gorge.
"Dallas!"
he yelled, his fingers scrambling for purchase on the smooth rock.
"Oh, fuck!"
he cried as he landed, twisting his knee the wrong way.
"Dallas, get me out of here!"
Dallas stepped to the edge of the crevice and peered down at the old man. He almost decided to abandon the packs and use the rope to pull his once friend to safety. Something inside the dark recesses of his heart made him reconsider. Save yourself. This haul will let me end the season early. With those words, he disappeared from Kenny's sight. After retrieving their packs and rifles, Dallas only got about 50 yards away before sitting down. While the view of the Appalachians was amazing, Kenny's cries for help ruined it. It was times like these that made him wish he smoked or had taken his buddy's advice and tried medicinal weed, anything to take the edge off. He was waiting for Kenny to stop screaming at him. Dallas didn't leave a man behind. It wasn't in the creed. But teaching someone a lesson about why is different. Once Kenny resigned himself to his fate and got silent, just like Dallas had when he almost drowned, He had deserved to be rescued. He closed his eyes for a moment and then smelled the now familiar stink of the creature that had been stalking them. He opened his eyes and scanned in front of him. Nothing but a mountain view. He turned his head and looked behind a tree just as a rock the size of a basketball flew by him, landing with a dull, wet thud 4 feet away. He flinched and then turned to look back again. He saw a tall, dark blur darting into the mountain underbrush. Dallas didn't hesitate. He hurled himself from the ground and reached for his rifle. A stone the size of a softball splintered a branch to his left. His flight instinct kicked in and he left it, turning on his heel and taking off in a sprint. The demon howled in rage behind him. A large stone hit the ground near his feet, followed by the sound of something giant smashing through the forest. He heard the beast catching up with him. The wind changed, overwhelming Dallas's nostrils with the stench. He saw a small cave formed by a landslide and he slid in, squeezing himself into the space and trying not to make a sound. He heard the beast crash through the underbrush as it ran past his hiding spot. Dallas refused to breathe and remained still, waiting for the creature to leave the area. His eyes scanned the entrance and he was about to move when the creature's face appeared. The demon's face was a mixture of ape and man covered in dull black hair. White froth foamed at its mouth. It let out a crazed screech that reverberated in the small space. Its breath reeked of death. Its hairy hands sporting black fingernails reached for Dallas. Dallas cursed himself for leaving his rifle where he dropped it. In desperation, he looked and felt around the cave for something to use as a weapon. He found a rock and began striking the creature's hand. After the third or fourth hit, Dallas heard the satisfying sound of bone breaking. The beast howled in pain and withdrew his arm. It screamed into the cave and then disappeared from the mouth, leaving Dallas alone. Dallas awoke with a start. A gentle breeze brought cool early evening air to him. Dirt and dried drool clung to his cheek. Other than a few bug bites, he was unharmed. Sniffing the air like a trapped animal, he could not smell the demon's scent. Slowly he clawed his way from the safety of the small cave. Standing upright to stretch, his back cracked loudly in the quiet. It took him a moment to sense that it was a little too quiet. Other than the breeze rustling leaf and limb, there was no noise. His heart began to race as he took off toward their abandoned packs and his gun. He would return for Kenny, and they would escape together. Then they could get a hunting party together to track down the beast. They would be rich. The shattering of his fibula and tibia brought Dallas back to reality, a jagged rock the size of a soccer ball smashing into his leg. Dropping to the ground, he began screaming. He knew this was the end. He was a broken animal with a predator nearby. The demon loomed over him, reaching down and grabbing Dallas's arms to lift him into the air. The creature howled at him, foamy spittle splattering his face. He felt his arms being pulled from their sockets, his body going numb as his mind tried to protect him from the pain. Images flashed before his eyes. His favorite teddy bear as a child, his first crush in second grade, Kenny teaching him to drive, his girlfriend breaking up with him before prom, shitting his pants the first time a Taliban fighter took a shot at him. The memories faded and Dallas felt as if he were falling. He felt a warm liquid covering his face as he crossed the void between life and death. Intense pain shot from his leg as he felt his body hit something. He forced his eyes open. He couldn't help but think how much the afterlife looked like Earth. "Dallas?" He heard a familiar voice and looked up, seeing Kenny running toward him. He tried to speak, to apologize for leaving Kenny behind to die. "Don't speak, son," Kenny said. Even through the pain, Dallas was amazed that Kenny had managed to find his gun, let alone get out of that crevice. The older man took his shirt off, revealing a faded volcano tattoo on his bicep. Dallas watched as Kenny pulled a knife and began cutting his shirt into strips, not understanding why the old man would do that to his own shirt. Dallas rolled his head to the other side and saw the demon. Its glassy eyes stared back at him with enlarged pupils before turning a gray-blue color. Suddenly, bloody viscera spilled from the chamber of its now exploded skull as Dallas's vision began to darken. Visions of being drugged through the hilly woods of the Appalachians interrupted Dallas's stupor. He was aware only vaguely of sunlight filtering through the leaves and branches of the trees. trying to look around but not being able to move his head, passing out again, waking up to Kenny giving him a sip from his canteen. Through the haze of these semi-lucid moments, Dallas heard Kenny arguing with himself.
If he can't forgive, then fuck him. Too much of his father in him.
The pain and anger in Kenny's voice stung as much as his words.
She was too good for the deadbeat. Biggest problem in this world is no one helps each other.
By the time Dallas felt himself swaying in the river waters, it was dark. The sound of a paddle struggling to move upstream blended with the chorus of the night.
This is huge. A real-life squatch, and I have proof.
Dallas could only moan softly as Kenny continued his diatribe.
There wouldn't have been any questioning your part of the spoils before, son. But now, I just don't know.
Red and blue lights roused Dallas as he was lifted and placed onto a stretcher. "Kenny," he said, briefly regaining the ability to turn his head before a paramedic placed a cervical collar around his neck. In the distance, his mentor was talking with a deputy. "Kenny," he reached for the old man.
"Sir?"
the paramedic said as she placed a hand on his chest.
"You need to be still."
Her voice caught Kenny's attention, who limped over.
"Hey, son,"
he said, eyes boring into Dallas's soul. "I'm sorry I left you. I was just trying to prove a point." A tear slid down his cheek. "I'm sorry for the shit I said about you and Mom, about holding on to that grudge for so long."
"It's okay."
Kenny smiled and held up the bag of ginseng.
"And once I lead a team back to the carcass, we're gonna be rich. Imagine it. Real proof of Sasquatch."
You're still gonna cut me in?" Dallas blurted out, remembering what he had heard. After everything?" Kenny patted him gently on the shoulder.
"Not going to lie, it's tempting. Real tempting. But all I ever wanted was your forgiveness."
He winked.
"Besides, the damn skeptics are going to try to tear the story apart. We got to hang together or our reputations will hang separately."
Dallas relaxed into the stretcher, relieved that all debts were square. As he closed his eyes, a mournful howl echoed through the mountains. He must have imagined it.
Death may be the greatest of all human blessings. Socrates. The lightkeeper was retiring. He had 2 wikis assisting, young lads whose job was, but not limited to, the responsibility of tending and trimming wicks for the light. All 3 men were being relieved from their duties, and they'd be off Flannan Islands in the remote Outer Hebrides on the coast of mainland Scotland very soon. This archipelago was remote and uninhabited. The 3 men were looking forward to leaving this barren rock. For the past 12 months, they'd been on duty, taking shifts. They were done with solitary life for a while. They wanted to get to the mainland, mix and mingle, and have a good night's rest in a comfortable bed. Their bodies were worn and their eyes were tired from guiding transatlantic ships toward the harbor in Leith, Scotland. The relief vessel, the Hesperus, carried the Lighthouse tender, who was going to go ashore and take over the duties until the full crew could join him. There'd been some terrible weather in recent days, and this delayed the relief ship an entire week. Concern had been raised as the steamer Arctur had reportedly passed by the Flannan Isles lighthouse, and her light was not operational. This was cause for concern, because the dark lighthouse meant real problems. When the Hesperus came upon the landing platform to the lighthouse, on the day Ratcliffe McLean was to go ashore and relieve the 3 men, he noticed, as well as the rest of the ship's crew, none of the men on the island were waiting for them on the dock, as procedure dictated. The captain sounded his horn, and a flare was released into the sky. No reply reciprocated from the island. Another peculiarity was the flagstaff was missing the signal flag. The crew of the Hesperus knew this was an ill omen. Ratcliffe demanded the supply boat be lowered into the water without delay. He'd go immediately to shore. Ratcliffe was not afraid, but apprehensive based on the oddities he'd witnessed on the island. Some might say he was a brave man, but he was, in fact, better described as a conscientious but not risk-taker. He was going to go beyond the strata of his own safety. He carried a locket that contained a picture of his deceased wife, who ironically had drowned 2 years ago in a freak accident when the boat on which she was a passenger tipped over and she plunged into the water, never resurfacing. She was a beauty, long, dark, flowing hair and fair skin. Ratcliffe took a look at the picture in the locket. He made eye contact with his wife, which for him was a sign of good luck. Closing the locket, he placed it in his vest pocket and prepared to launch for shore. He went alone, rowing through relatively calm waters, pointed toward the black precipices and craggy clefts barren of vegetation. Part of the island was hidden in a sea of vapor, but he steered directly to the dock. Upon arrival, he made note of more irregularities. Both the entrance gate and the gate leading up to the compound were shut. This submerged him into suspicion. Ratcliffe remembered he was carrying a loaded revolver, and if there was trouble, he would not be hesitant to use it. There was an unexplained eeriness, causing the hairs on the back of his neck to stand up. With the sky turning gray, with a backdrop of gloom, he ascended the long staircase leading up to the lighthouse. Every step of the 160 total steps was a foreboding reminder that he was most likely alone, and possibly something tragic or sinister could have happened to the three men. He was breathless once he finished his exhausting climb to the lighthouse itself. His nostrils were filled with the smell of the sea, mingled with lime wash and tar. The tower was a beautiful sight, standing 23 meters tall, like a monument erected to the god of light. The wind was picking up, and Ratcliffe felt the raw power of the turbulent flow as it got closer to the structure. It consisted of a circular 3-stage tower with a 1-story keeper's house on the northwest corner. The second stage consisted of a corbelled walkway and steel railing, and topping the tower was a cast-iron deck. He couldn't imagine where the others were. They should have greeted him the moment he came ashore. Cautiously, he entered the lighthouse through the unlocked door to find many other disturbing things. The air was cold. No fire had been lit for some days, and a dampness crawled into his clothing. Initially, he found no signs of a struggle or foul play. There was no indication from first view, no evidence there had been a mutiny or violence of any kind. The beds were unmade. The mechanical clock had wound down in the kitchen. There was food on the table, and a chair had been left knocked over. This was an indication that whatever happened to the three men must have caused great alarm and happened unexpectedly and quickly. There was a set of unused oilskins still hanging on a peg, which meant one man must have gone out without any waterproof clothing during the storm. It had been a bitter cold winter, so why would anyone, under any circumstances, think it was a good idea to go out into a storm without their oilskins on? Especially since this was December in the Outer Hebrides. How could 3 experienced lighthouse keepers have just disappeared from their posts? Ratcliffe concluded it was possible, when the storm hit, 2 men must have gone out to store equipment. When they didn't return, the 3rd man left his post, which was a severe violation for leaving the lighthouse unattended, and in breaking this rule, he must have been swept away, possibly by a rogue wave. It was simply a tragic act of nature. Storm conditions, gale force winds must have swept the men away. The geos, or narrow gullies, could create gigantic waves due to how the water was channeled. He was obligated to submit his findings. Ratcliffe sent word back to the ship he was staying on to perform an investigation. He suggested the Hesperus return to port, and he'd give his findings to the Northern Lighthouse Board so they could start an investigation. In the meantime, he would gather as much evidence as he could and wait for the investigating superintendent to arrive from Edinburgh. After further investigating, he concluded that there was no other life to be found on the island. He crawled over rocks, walked the shoreline, even fired a flare, but received no response. Down by the landing platform, he discovered the mooring ropes, landing ropes, and derrick landing ropes were strewn about and tangled on the rocks. These ropes were usually held in a brown crate 70 feet above the platform on a supply crane. The iron railing around the landing was warped and twisted out of shape. It also appeared a sizable piece of rock had come loose and tumbled down the jagged cliff face, smashing at the bottom. He also made note that a life buoy was missing, torn free from the path's handrail. The iron railings around the crate platform, from the terminus of the tramway to the concrete steps up from the west landing, were twisted as well. Maybe the lighthouse keepers had gone down to save the crate and tragedy hit them. But if this were the case, where were the bodies? He assumed there'd be a good possibility of them washing back up on the shore, yet no one was found. According to the clock, which was frozen in time, whatever had happened a week prior was at the same time the storm had blown through. Ratcliffe returned to the lighthouse and located the logbook and found it to be quite unsettling. Some of the last logs entered were terrifying. Severe winds, the likes of which I've never seen before. Gale north by northwest. Sea lashed into a fury. Waves very high, tearing at the lighthouse. It also appeared, from what was written, the men at one point were all together crying. What an odd entry, thought Ratcliffe. These men were quite tough. It must have been a storm from the abyss. Other log entries showed desperation while the storm raged on, and the men resorted to praying for their lives. Questions arose in Ratcliffe's mind. Why would these seasoned lighthouse keepers be afraid of a storm? Fascinatingly, on the dates they described the storm hitting, there were no storms reported in the area by anyone. The storms, which had delayed him from arriving on the island on time, had hit 3 days later than their entry indicated. The weirdest log entry was the final log, which read, "Storm ended. Sea calm. God is over all." What was meant by God is over all? Puzzled and concentrating hard, nothing made sense to him. 3 men snatched off the rock of Island Moor without a trace. The sort of thing just didn't happen. Island Moor was the largest of 7 rocky outcrops, 45 rocks and islets. The men could have rode out the worst of the storms, and the mystery was, why did they leave the safety of the lighthouse? Ratcliffe could not get over the fact that the crew had recorded the storm, but no storm had come until many days later. Ratcliffe made his way up to the tower to the watchroom and found everything to be in order. The raison d'etre was protected by a dome cap and a weather vane. He ventured out onto the balcony and saw nothing to cause distress or concern. The astragal, which is a metal bar dividing the lantern glass into sections, was undamaged. He noticed a faint paraffin odor in the air, not so unusual since the lighthouse used this fuel to operate. He looked about the chariot, which is a wheeled carriage at the bottom of the Fresnel lens assembly, an optic consisting of a convex lens and umpteen prisms of glass, which focus and energize the light through reflection and refraction. All appeared to be operational, capable of allowing the clamshell-shaped lens to rotate around a circular iron track atop the lens pedestal. It was positive the height of the focal plane would be accurate. Everything appeared unremarkable with the light itself. For now, Ratcliffe knew he would have to be the interim lightkeeper until relief came in a few days. He returned to the kitchen in order to make himself some dinner. He'd lost track of time and night had fallen. He didn't want to move many things around for fear he may impede the investigation when the investigating superintendent arrived from Edinburgh in the next few days. He did keep a journal, and on day 1, began to fill the pages with his own investigation and findings. His first entry was December 26, and read, "Arrived at Flannan Isle Lighthouse. All is not well. All 3 lightkeepers have vanished without a trace. Searched the island and the lighthouse itself. It's apparent that they were under great distress from the storm. All 3 men abandoned the lighthouse at some point. The living quarters were disheveled, signs of panic all around. It's likely that their last meal was interrupted. I'll include their log journal in this investigation to testify to their mental capacity in their final hours. Much of what I've observed shows possible madness caused by the fear of a storm and possible isolation syndrome." December 27. I awoke this morning to find the lighthouse in full operation. The lamp was burning bright, 144,000 candle power, shooting its beam 20 miles out. This is impossible. There was a white flag flying on the flagstaff. How this got there and raised is beyond my comprehension. I skipped breakfast and investigated the outside surroundings. The weather is bitterly cold. The water spray is enormous today. My main concern is, how did the lamp burn all by itself, and how did that flag get raised? December 28. I had a miserable night's sleep. I tossed and turned, and when I finally slept, I was restless. I was sleeping, yet not sleeping deeply enough to wane off the hints of nightmarish images and visions which taunted me. I may have drunk too much coffee before bed. I will not make that same mistake again. I woke up exhausted, so I decided to do very little and catch up on my sleep and start afresh tomorrow. Late entry. Right before bed, as I was about to extinguish my IOV lamp for a brief moment, I swore I heard a man's voice. It was faint, and the tempest was whistling outside dreadfully, but I had to guess one way or the other. I swear it was a voice. I went to the window and looked out, but all that was visible was darkness and the splatter of rain against the window pane. December 29. Oddly, there was absolute silence when I woke up this morning. I got myself dressed. I heard neither wind nor rain. I went up into the lighthouse tower to find that the light was not illuminated. I wasn't about to touch a thing, much less carry fuel up and down this cast-iron serpentine staircase. I would have breakfast, which I did. Afterwards, I dressed warmly and made my way outside to attempt to recreate what those 3 men were possibly doing when they were snatched away. I climbed the rocks again, looking for clothing, a boot, a hat, something that may have blown out of their pockets on that fateful day. All I could see were rocks, and more rocks. Rock formed from cooled lava and dolerites, intruding Archean gneiss, a type of metamorphic rock created by extreme pressure. I'm not sure what I expected to find. I covered many acres and found not one single hint as to where the 3 poor souls went. I'm now back inside and trying to stay warm. December 30. Something terribly disturbing for me to wake up to. All 3 beds were made up on my waking. I swear I did not touch their beds. I'm sleeping on a cot I found on the supply closet. All 3 beds were perfectly made. Someone or something is playing a trick on me. First, there was the lamp burning without fuel, then the distant voice of a man, and now the beds. I'm either in a haunting, or I'm losing my mind. I interrogated my mind, looking for any objective that would bring me resolution. I searched the closets, under the beds, checked the locks in the door, which I pathologically lock each night. I am a man of routine. I am the only person in the lighthouse. It is perfectly clear I have been visited. December 31st. I'm sleeping with my revolver now. Not that it would have any effect on a spook. I don't believe in such things. People allow their imaginations to run wild, and they invent all sorts of scary monsters and devilish fiends. Never had interest in such rubbish. I am a man of principle, fact, a man of science. I sat listening most of the morning for sounds or movements or anything amiss. Late afternoon, I went to make myself a coffee, and the coffee pot had already boiled. I lie not. I did not boil the jug, but when I went to make coffee, the water was steaming hot. January 1st, the new year. The temperature's freezing. I still have fire and food. I expect the relief ship with the investigators soon. Hope they arrive expeditiously. I feel as though things here are darkening. I'll be honest, I'm bewildered. There's an imponderable evil enmeshed in the soul of this place, cackling at me, watching me, and drawing the darker things closer. I'm no phrenologist, so I am no expert. Yes, I can maintain and operate a lighthouse, but I know nothing about haunted lighthouses. Today, in the kitchen, I found a chair which had been knocked over during the time the 3 lightkeepers went missing, to be upright and pushed to the table like the other chairs. I purposely have not touched the dining set, not wanting to contaminate any evidence that might remain. I feel a presence, something unseen but acknowledged, in unspoken respect of the unknown. I'm going outside less. I'm not going to the light at all. I think there's something not quite right about this lighthouse. January 2nd. It has been too many days now. I would have expected my relief with an investigating officer to have already arrived. There must be some sort of delay. I can sense the weather is changing outside. It doesn't look good. Bad weather will delay their arrival. This is something I had not counted on, nor can I afford such a long wait. My nerves are getting the best of me. I catch myself humming stupid little songs just so I don't go mad. I have some reading material I thoughtfully brought with me, but reading often puts me to sleep, and now I'm uncomfortable with closing my eyes. When I do close my eyes, strange and peculiar things happen. This has led me to the wildest conjectures and greatest disappointments. I could no longer depend on my theoretical extrapolations. All I had was conjecture, no positives or proofs. January 3rd. I was startled out of my sleep by the voices and wailing of men. My mind was in the early morning fog, and my eyes were adjusting to the peculiar spectacle. This was beyond the scope of the ordinary. I had to be dreaming, I thought. I knew no one else was on the island. I was alone. Where were those copious, incessant wails coming from? I had to be careful, not foolhardy. Had someone come ashore while I was asleep? It was doubtful, but not impossible. You'd think a strong man with a revolver would never feel fear, uncertainty, or extreme apprehension, but it's not the case. I stuffed my fingers in my ears as an experiment. If I could still hear them, it would suggest I had gone mad, and all of this congruence I was experiencing was merely in my head. It would be an undeniable concern for sure, yet treatable. If I stopped hearing the sounds of mournful men, the solution would be these men were real and somewhere nearby. As soon as my fingers were inserted, the wailing ceased. What is their game? Why the trickery? They're not fooling anyone. I'm off to see if I can uncover this horrible trick and expose it for what it is, a con, a farce, nothing but deception. Late entry. I have once again searched everywhere within earshot of my last position, and have come up empty. January 4th. I just realized this is the new year. I find it ever so strange to enter a new year alone on an island with the paranormal present. I smelled a strong, meaty smell of bacon. I examined the kitchen no bacon was found. Maybe it was wafting from the walls where the smell had embedded itself through the full year of frying bacon for breakfast. I heard a rattling of chains outside, put on my oilskins, and proceeded outside. It was frigid and damp. Thank God there was no rain. I searched over the right slope of the lighthouse because the sound seemed to resonate for me, but I had no success. January 5th. I had a dream of little people. Little people with an unrecognizable dialect. They had surrounded my bed as I slept. These fey people in the dream did not appear to want to cause me harm, but I had an unpleasant uneasiness with them, standing there looking at me while I slept. I'm sure it was just a dream. January 6th. I'm getting tired of eating canned fish daily, but with no sight of my relief, I must ration. I cannot imagine what the delay could be. I've not seen evidence of a storm. I will light the lamp tonight and send out a distress code for any passing ships. Matter of fact, I've not noticed a single ship while I've been marooned here. January 7th. I'm afraid now. I'm terrified. My pertinacity is caving in. I'm weakening. The blackness I sense has sponged my bravery away, leaving me consumed by fright. I lit the oil furnace, and as the room heated, I heard a rap at the door. My heart leapt with excitement, for I believed it to be my relief. When I answered the door, no one was there. On my life, I swear, on my eternal verities, on my peripheral vision, I saw a fleeting, dark-haired woman rush out of view. Although I was not dressed for the cold, I went hurriedly in pursuit. I swear I saw her, a woman with long dark hair and a white dress. But my pursuit was in vain. She was not to be found. I'm convinced now, more than ever, that I'm bewitched in some capacity. In the uncharted vastness of my inner habitation, somehow she had touched me intimately. Was she engaging in some dreadful malignity? My apperception and concept of time were retreating me into a prison of abstraction. I'm forever accursed and alone. The island seems to possess dark secrets, hidden intrigue, and troubling, surreptitious mysteries. She looked much like my beautiful lost wife. January 8th. The storm of the century has come to this place. I have lit the light and began sending distress signals out across the water. But no ship would or could sail these waters. I mopped water from the kitchen before bed. A window was cracked open, which I did not open myself and had not noticed this entire time. The kitchen was very wet. January 9th. Daytime is gloomy and dark, for the storm still rages on, and the sky is a torrent of foulness. I suffer through the elemental sounds mixed with chthonic fury, and it intensified incrementally, from rudimentary beginnings into crude distortions of unimaginable scale. I'm urged by the tingling of my weary nerves to brace myself as catastrophic gale force winds and devastating, noisy rain batter the place unapologetically. I cannot take more of this blitz. The storm is crescendoed, and I know I'm to die. Moreover, it relinquishes its magnitude of terror, and as far as I can see, the lighthouse still stands. The light has been turned red without me touching it. How is this possible? I don't know. It's no longer illuminating white. It has a red glow as of a fire. I've been locked out of the lantern room and cannot find my key. I did not lock the hatch, but it's bolted shut and my key is lost. It is imperative I open the hatch. The tower still glows red. I cannot compass these intriguing happenings. The parameters of my expertise are being stretched. The infinite pathos of my emotions is being strung thin. January 10th. I've stopped sleeping. I'm eating very little. I wonder if my relief is lost at sea, or worse, maybe the maelstrom has dragged them down into the depths. I am praying. January 11th. I awoke, still sitting at the kitchen table, where exhaustion must have overtaken me. Here's the thing you will not believe. The woman with the dark hair was in the kitchen, with her back to me at the stove. Was she here to inveigle me? My only sense was my sight. All other senses were numb and deadened. I focused, trembling at the sight of this woman. I have no idea how she could have entered. Everything was fast and tight. Her unnatural taciturnity troubled me. She never said a word. She stood unconcerned, not at all acknowledging my presence. This was an insoluble enigma. I cleared my throat to get her attention, to make myself known. When I did, her body flinched, then disarticulated in a sickening display of contortion, as if she had a severe delirium episode. Then the image evaporated as if she had never existed. In desperation and despair, I sat frozen in disbelief, constricted in my throat. I could not make a sound or release even a whimper. But I saw this with my own eyes. I do not exaggerate. The light in the tower still burns a majestic beacon of red, flashing twice every 30 seconds. And my key has still not been located. January 12th. The storm has ceased. Something beckons me, drawing me to the window. I hear the screeching sounds of birds outside. I first imagine it is seabirds that have flown in from the neighboring island, so I go outside to have a look. Up to this point, I've not remembered seeing any birds on the island. To my astonishment, there are a dozen or so enormous birds of prey sitting on the wall which surrounds the tower. They are not guillemot or shag. These birds are much larger. They skulk and twist their heads, as if measuring me up as their next meal. Birds have the head shape of a southern cassowary, but a leaner body like a lammergeier, but twice the size. I noticed before heading for cover that their talons were unusually long, like grizzly bear claws. That means one thing. They're meat-eaters, killers, practiced in the art of savagery. In no way am I returning outside until I can be sure they're gone. January 13th. The birds are still out there. These menacing creatures are not seabirds. How have they come to this island? Today I observed through the window the birds are off the wall and edging closer to the door. I feel they're waiting for me to step out. I cannot leave for fear I will be eaten. This has caused me to become upset, like a foreign umbrage has assailed me. I do not have enough bullets for all of these raptors. I need more paraffin oil, so I'll have to make an attempt. January 14th. No birds lurking today. I made a successful trip to retrieve more oil. Still haven't figured out how the light is working without being maintained. I dare not speculate in my mentally disheveled state. I'm becoming more unstable, emotional. My comprehension must be more in focus. I must try the hatch open and evaluate this mystery closer. The first time was a feeble attempt, but the second time, success. I pried the hatch, broke the lock, and entered the lantern room. The moment I entered, the light shut off its red glow. I closely examined and scrutinized every inch, every nook and cranny. I heard a bird chirp, not one of the massive prehistoric vultures outside, but a small, whimsical chitter. It was a canary. It landed on my shoulder. I was startled at first, but it seemed harmless. I assumed one of the men had brought it as a pet. I polished the lens to the light and returned downstairs. January 15th. Heavy, impenetrable veil of fog has set in. I'm debating whether to start the light again. I need more oil. Retrieve the oil? No sign of the giant birds. The little canary's doing well. It's eating, and I located its cage. I am in incipient danger in some intangible way. I'm thinking of myself as a denizen of this place, like I belong here. Then it all could be some narcotic-like dream, ethereal, not subjected to the outside world. January 16th. The fog won't lift. Started the light again in hopes someone will see it. It's beaming white light. I'm still perplexed over the red glow from days ago. I saw wet footprints through the kitchen area, as if someone barefoot walked through from out in the rain. The size of the prints was small, like a woman's. I have to imagine it was the dark-haired woman. I ask myself, am I completely mad yet? Or have I developed lissophobia and will soon be schizophrenic? Is this how it starts? The delusions are growing in intensity. I saw a figure, not a woman, but something else, like a shadow figure, a black-masked djinn, peering around the doorframe. When my eyes caught sight of it, it moved back out of sight. I know I sound pusillanimous, but I physically jumped. A contemptible, dark thing was seen for only an instant, yet purblind, daunted by this sense of mystery and shock, it has plagued my mind. January 17th. I've grown more nervous, and anxiety is hard to be back. The fog won't lift. I ventured outside, needed air, needed more space. I saw the dark-haired woman in white on the steps, going down to the sea. I called to her, and for a brief moment she stopped as if she'd heard me, but she never looked around. I called again and began to chase after her. As God is my witness, the woman began to dissipate before my very eyes. She went into a round, bounding down the stairs, lifted her arms over her head, and turned into a ball of light that shot into the night sky like a rocket. I've never seen anything like it before. I cannot sleep. I keep thinking about the woman I've seen a few times here. She must be an apparition. A human being, unless they're a ghost, just doesn't turn into a specter and vanish into a ball of illumination. My question is, where has she come from? Why does she look so much like my wife? I must see her face, but I dare not tempt the dead. Before the Lighthouse was built here, I know this chain of islands had a miserable reputation, and this was called the Island of the Dead, or the Seven Hunters, because of how many ships had come too close and hit the rocks only to sink to the bottom. I do not exaggerate. This is not a figment of my imagination. Could it be some who perished on these deadly rocks before the lighthouse was constructed walk the rocks of Island Moor today? If I ever believed before, I believe now in the existence of the living dead. As for necromancy, magic, or otherworldly phantoms, maybe stuck in a purgatory? I don't know. I'm no expert on the matter of occult practices or mysticism. I can only believe what I see. January 18. I've been abandoned, exiled away from the living. I heard footsteps in the living area last night. It sounded like a single person walking about. I was too overcome with fright to cry out or to look for myself. I went up to the parapet to get air, breathing in the fresh air and listening to the crashing of the waves below. I cannot stay here forever. I will soon be out of supplies and will starve. I suppose I could use a bullet, and if the enormous birds return, I could shoot one. I have no idea how the other birds would react. Would they attack me? If it comes down to it, I'll kill one of the birds to survive. January 19. Another rough storm's blown in. It woke me with the sheets of lightning, reiterating the rolling and cracking collapse of thunder like cannonball fire. There was this brooding, torrential, malefic fury. The building, as sturdy as she was, shook and shivered. Piled logs on the fire to gain more heat and light for the room. I heard pretentious laughing through it all, the sound of more than one man laughing in a cachinnated mockery. I could not make out what they were laughing about. Gesticulation and laughter and deep collective breathing impinged on my sovereignty as a man. I did get up and walk through the living space. I heard faintly convulsed laughter, lost, echoing in the cisterns of thought. I prayed for faith. I hoped the voices would lead me. I asked God for spiritual vitality, and I wept for no reason. I was losing myself in the murky purlieus of impossible thought with vague imaginations when somehow I began to feel coeval with the lighthouse, as if it saw my heart. I gathered my emotions and set out to see what I could discover, since the voices had gone silent. My curiosity took me to the light. There, I witnessed moving shadows in the shape of people hovering before my eyes, not fixed on the wall as they should be, but as if they were beckoning me. My eyes were impeded by the glare of an oil lamp, but I saw long, ink-black tentacles reaching out as if they were attempting to escape. A serried army of phantoms, all in rank, moved and swelled, becoming stealth-like at times, sweeping, deepening, in blackness which held me in impalpable terror during this slow fest of writhing, faceless torture. Unexpectedly, the shadows were absorbed into the darkness, as if a great force bowed them swiftly away. I fell down, exhausted. My strength was ebbing, and I was cold and stiff. I caught myself trembling. How long had this side effect been going on? I needed rest. January 20th. It is with disquiet and dread I continue my journal. I noticed, after checking on the light and winding the clock, that the wick needed replacing. I've done regular maintenance and changed out the wick. After saturation, I lit the wick, and capillary action was normal. Pumps working normal, still anticipating a relief vessel anytime. I've always frowned upon the thoughts of clairaudience. Never have I been interested in the psychical, nor am I theosophical-minded. Yet there had been a deleterious influence upon my rationale. I could not consider any of my convictions absolute. Obstinately, I denied the existence of ghosts, apparitions as the figment of fanciful imaginations inflated rapidly by fraudulent, mendacious, unprincipled, and uncouth inventions of the duplicitous. January 21st. I'm going mad. I awoke early morning to find I'd sleepwalked out of the lighthouse. I found myself swathed in mist at the edge of a cliff, looking down at the water as black as nori. The ambient exhalation from the sea must have awakened me. The shock of my position, inches from falling into the black abyss of tumbling waves, drew me a smothered scream in frantic admonitions as my hands pressed hard against my mouth. I'd been caught in languor and reverie, a dream state. I stood astonished at the panoramic view of the great Atlantic Ocean. As harrowing as this was, and as volatile as I had become, I returned, drenched from head to foot, to the lighthouse, where I stoked a fire and prayed. January 22nd. I'm ablaze with fever. I'm a sweltering, perspiring mess. My skin is seeping from every pore. While I washed my face in the early morning at the basin I'd filled with hot water from the stove, I heard a repeated tapping. Tap, tap, tap. I thought it was coming from the window. I looked out and saw those enormous rooks, or whatever they were, flocking around my door. They were pecking at the door as if they were attempting to break in. I retrieved my revolver and covered the door. The hideous squawks and squeaks of those rapacious fowl needled into my brain. I warned them with loud shouts, but the pecking continued. I thought at this rate they'd be inside and upon me in no time. I banged on the door with my fists. This seemed to make them stop, but then they started again more viciously, with devilish intent. I could not allow them inside. I would have no place to retreat, to accept the lantern room. And purposely not repaired the lock I'd broken, so I would have a way of escape. I aimed my gun at the door at a level that if I fired, it would hit at least one of them in the chest. I had every right to be ornithophobic. I fired my revolver. With a bang, the bullet tore through the wood, and a hideous cacophony of wings, beating and thrashing, rose as a clamor of excitement ignited at the door. I ran quickly to the window to evaluate the damage. 2 of the freakish birds were down on the ground. They were not moving or fluttering at all. The sky became black. This was the moment I saw the murmuration of thousands of birds, twisting and turning, rolling in coordinated patterns high above. A dozen or so living birds took flight, swooshing away with incredible power to join the others. I watched until, while on the edge, they became one, and no one bird was distinct. I've never seen such a phenomenon in all my life. They rose out of sight and were gone. Once I'd gathered myself, I retrieved the birds and brought them inside, where I carved them like a Christmas turkey. I was not about to let this go to waste. Despite what I'd witnessed, I was desperate and delirious. I was struggling with apoplectic thoughts from fever, which still clung to me like a steaming hot cloth. January 23rd. My fever broke last night, but not until I had some disturbing dreams and restless sleep. After making sure the coast was clear, I took the leftover pieces of these 2 birds. I would gladly dine heartily for the next few days. When I returned to the lighthouse, I was spooked to see there were 3 lit candles flickering on the kitchen table. Impossible. I was not only flummoxed by this unexpected magic trick, but I was truly petrified. I'm not alone. I'm not in control. I'm aghast by what I'm witnessing here. I could not be more alarmed than I am right now. This is what I thought until I left the candles burning and walked to the bedroom where I found 3 men sleeping in their beds. This could not be. My mind was endangered, and it exploded like the force of cannon fire. I was thinking more unthinkable thoughts. I'd left my revolver on the table. I backed away, returning to the kitchen. I fetched my gun and slowly made my way as quietly and furtively as I could to the bedroom to find the beds empty. It has been a late night. I'm writing with my back to the wall, giving the place a good looking over. Nothing else out of the ordinary is manifested. Getting tired. Memory is fading. I'm forgetting who I am. Who I was. January 24th. While sleeping, there was a flash, both fire and ice, and my heart was filled in my sleep state with inevitable conviction and unpleasantries so maniacal, I couldn't be certain I still existed in the land of the living. The little people who had surrounded my bed in the first few days of my quarantine here returned to my dreams. They call themselves Los Burden. They were diminutive pygmies and did not mean me any harm. They're not happy I shot their birds. They took one of the carcasses and left me with the other. They spoke in monosyllables, reluctant utterances of febrile madness, but I understood all of their gibberish. When I awoke, I found one bird had been taken. This plumbed the depths of my heart, drawing out like water from a well, inconsistencies revealing no rhyme nor reason. I spent the day polishing the lamp, filling the fountain, and checking all the blinds on the windows. January 25th. I've been praying Bible verses I memorized as a child. I sought after a Bible, hoping the good book could give me strength and courage, but reciting the Lord's Prayer in the 23rd Psalm eased my worries somewhat. I heard voices again, rattling chains, and there was moaning. I prayed louder. I have my revolver with me now, always. Rain is falling again. I'm drowning myself in notes of black caffeine. At least the coffee is in abundance. January 26th. I didn't sleep. I ate some of the bird I'd killed and became deathly ill. Poisoned, it seems. I'm sweating with a fever, yet I'm shivering cold. I tried drinking water, but it all came back up. I must rest. January 27th. Still alive. January 28th. Vivid dreams of dying. Peaceful, floating, drifting. My mind is hyperaged. The levee has broken and is pouring ever more infamously, like a fractured cataract. Overswollen, flooding over its banks, running, draining. I pray that I see the dark-haired woman again before my time's done. What if it is my wife? I still have never seen her face. January 29th. It's snowing outside. I managed to make it to the window. I ate some stale crackers. I'm still praying. God is over all. A light flurry of snow in the air, the relief vessel arrived with the investigating superintendent, Benjamin Fairbanks, from Edinburgh. He was accompanied by 4 other men who were keen on gathering the facts and evidence of the disappearance of the 3 lightkeepers. The flag was flying on the flagstaff, which is a good sign. They walked the lengthy steps up to the lighthouse, where they found the door unlocked. The first concern was a bullet hole in the door leading into the living quarters. It was certainly not characteristic of a lighthouse. Who would need to discharge a weapon if they were alone? Benjamin let himself in cautiously. The other men followed. He called out Ratcliffe's name, but received no answer. They searched the lighthouse, which was in order. They took note of the broken latch to the lantern room, but everything else was in its proper place. The table was clean. There was wood in the stove, but it was not lit. The clocks were wound. The beds were made. Everything was as it should be, with the exception of the missing Ratcliffe McLean. There were no bloodstains, nothing broken, nothing surmisable. There was no evidence he had ever been there, except one of the men spotted a revolver, his revolver, in a small woodpile beside the stove. After a quick examination, they determined 1 round had been fired. The question arose, why would he have the need to fire a round? They looked for other bullet holes, but found none. A thorough sweep of the lighthouse proved fruitless. They took their investigation outside. They combed the craggy, foreboding archipelago. Benjamin ordered the men to keep up their search as he retreated to the lighthouse. He was in desperation to find the logbook. He wanted to see with his own eyes how the 3 missing men had recorded their final days. Locating the logbook in a bottom drawer of a desk, he sat and opened it up. There he found a journal of Ratcliffe McLean. The dates of Ratcliffe's entries puzzled Benjamin. It was such an unaccountable thing. The journal was dated from December 27th, and Ratcliffe's last entry was January 29th. This could not be. Absolutely it could not be. Benjamin scratched his head. He reasoned how impossible and absurd this was. Ratcliffe had a journal for more than 30 days. Benjamin knew for a fact that today's date was December 31st, and tomorrow was the New Year. Why would Ratcliffe have written things which happened on days that had not yet happened? what gave him cold chills was Ratcliffe's last entry. God is over all. It was the same phrase, verbatim, that the missing lighthouse keepers had recorded after they wrote the storm had gone. Ratcliffe's locket with the picture of his wife was recovered on a cliff overlooking the water. Nothing of Ratcliffe's body was found.
Chilling tales for dark nights.